Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of September 26, 2021. We are going to have a stimulating conversation today on the ethics of life extension, how that relates to the impacts of technology, and whether the pursuit of life extension research and implementation is beneficial on balance. So we have an illustrious panel today of US Transhumanist Party officers and members. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg. We have our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton. We have our Director of Community Resilience, Alexandria Black. We have our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. We have our Northern California Liaison, Celeste Castaldo. And we have our Technology Advisor and Foreign Ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Luis Cordero. And our special guest today is Professor John K. Davis. He is Professor of Philosophy at California State University, Fullerton. And he is the author of an intriguing book titled New Methuselahs, The Ethics of Life Extension. So welcome, Professor Davis. It's an honor to have you here. And I would like to start by asking you to give an overview of the key arguments in New Methuselahs and how you came to the conclusion as to why human life extension is on balance beneficial and life extension research should be funded aggressively.
Well, thank you, Gennady. Pleased to be here. So I'll start with a little bit of overview about life extension itself. I won't go into too much detail because I think most of your viewers already know quite a bit about this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Life extension consists of slowing or halting or conceivably reversing the processes of aging at a molecular or cellular level. It's not immortality. It's simply normal biological life, but with slower aging or no aging at all. So with that in mind, I find it helpful to distinguish between moderate life extension, where you would slow it. Some scientists conservatively estimate we might live for 120 years, but they're not necessarily willing to go further than that. Or radical life extension, which would last far longer, where you actually halt aging and die only of non-age-related causes. In general, I think for the foreseeable future, and I won't speculate about farther out than that, the likely methods of life extension will include one or more of the following three things: either drugs, stem cell treatments, or genetic engineering. This is going to be important because a lot of the arguments that you hear against life extension presume that it's sort of like the kind of immortality we get in fairy tales and stories where some malevolent wizard makes you live forever and then you regret it. This is not going to be like that. This is going to be a reversible decision. In fact, it's probably a decision that would have to be medically reaffirmed every time you take those drugs again or whatever else it is that you need there. It's also not end-of-life care. Again, it's a slowed or halted aging. Now, I think I don't need to sell the plausibility of this to this audience, but you all know Google has put quite a lot of money into this through Calico. I believe Jeff Bezos recently announced he's interested in this. The National Institutes of Health even have a group dealing with this, and that's a fairly mainstream organization. And there have been a lot of studies with animal species where they've actually dramatically slowed aging to various degrees with various species. So I think it's coming. I don't know when it's coming. I don't know how much it's going to cost initially, but I felt it was time to take it seriously when I wrote the book. And so I did that. One thing I want to say about this is my overall position is simply that number one, it's a good thing. We should fund the research aggressively, probably more aggressively than we're doing now, although I don't have a clear fix on how much money Silicon Valley is putting into this. So maybe we have enough, I don't know. Secondly, for moral reasons, I'm not in favor of forcing life choices on other people. If somebody doesn't want this for whatever reason, I would never suggest that they should be put in a position where they have no choice. Similarly, I would never stop anybody from doing it. So I'm a sort of a standard John Stuart Mill style liberal on that sort of thing. I do think for moral reasons we'll get into later on, it's imperative that this be subsidized to whatever extent is fiscally possible for those who can't afford it through no fault of their own. I have reasons of justice for that position. And I also believe, and I'll get into this in a moment, that there is a real possibility in the long run that radical life extension, the kind of life extension where you might live for centuries, could produce some severe population pressures. And I have some suggestions for how to deal with that. I think sometimes when people talk about life extension, they talk about it in a fairly toggle switch kind of way. It's either all good or all bad. And this can happen on both sides of the debate. I think the thing we have to bear in mind is it's neither going to be all good nor all bad. If you ask whether electric cars, for example, are a good thing, the answer is, well, I think they are. But yes, you've got to dispose of the batteries. Yes, mining lithium is problematic. Yes, you've got to find another way to finance highways. And yes, it's easy to hit somebody if they can't hear your car coming because the engine doesn't make any noise. But on balance, the pros outweigh the cons. So I'm about to buy an electric car. And it's the same with life extension. I think some people have seen my work and thought that because I've pointed out some downside or some drawback or some problem, that I'm against it. Emphatically, I'm not against it. I'm very much in favor of it. But I also think that when you talk to the general public, you have to be honest about the drawbacks or the downsides of whatever it is you're urging and be ready to do something about them. And I'll try to do that here. In general, I think it's helpful to say that most of the moral and policy issues raised by the prospect of human life extension fall into one of three broad categories. And I'll go into each one of these in a bit more detail. The first category has to do with whether extended life is desirable. There are people out there who think it's not, and I devoted the first 2 or 3 chapters of my book to that set of issues. I think it is, and I'll explain why I think it is in a moment, but I'm going to try to explain the case they make against it. The second set of issues has to do with what I call the Malthusian Problem, and that's raised by the possibility that if people lived long enough, we might have population pressures and environmental pressures that are very difficult to deal with. I'll say a lot more about that in a moment. Frankly, I consider that the biggest problem with life extension. It's the hardest one to solve. And then thirdly, there's the justice issue. What happens if not everyone gets this? What do we do about that? What do we do if we can't make it available to everybody? Should we let it go forward or not? And so forth. We'll talk about that as well. So I'll start with the desirability issues. And I have to say, I don't find any of these arguments very, very persuasive, but I need to treat them with respect because many people do find them quite persuasive. There is, let me, hang on just a sec here. I'm going to start with a very quick argument in favor of extended life, just to kind of set the tone here. This is the one I like to use with people who are skeptics. So I say to them, suppose you're at your moment of death, and suddenly God appears right above your hospital bed. You say, my gosh, you exist. And then second question, is there an afterlife? And God says, well, there is, but I've changed it recently. I kept getting a lot of complaints that it lacked meaning, it was boring, and so forth and so on. So I've revised it, and here's the new deal. New deal is this: your afterlife is optional. If you think you're better off not living forever, you don't have to, or you should be annihilated right now. If you do continue living, it'll be a life very much like what you have now, except you'll enjoy the kind of health and vitality you had in your 20s. Moreover, it doesn't have to go on forever. You can choose annihilation anytime you want, but it's a one-way trip. So the question is, would you turn down that offer? And I think anybody who tells me they would turn down life extension also has to declare they would turn down that offer from God and say, no, I don't want that kind of an afterlife. That doesn't suit me at all. And I think it's very hard to make that case with a straight face. So, and yet you hear a lot of arguments against this. In fact, it's a fairly widespread view that there's something wrong with this. There are surveys from the Pew Research Religion and Public Life project back in 2013, where 56% of people said they would not want life extension if it were offered. Only 41% thought it would be good for society. There was a survey by 2 universities in Australia that found similar results. 38.9% of their respondents said they thought extended life would do them more harm than good. And I can give you other surveys like this. Very often when I present on this topic to audiences outside the transhumanist community, I get a lot of pushback from a certain part of the audience that just does not want to hear about this and does not think that it's worthwhile. Now, some of this may be adaptive preferences, right? We've had to live with the inevitability of death within something less than a century for a long time. And so an adaptive preference is where you adapt what you want to what you can get. But having said that, there's a set of arguments that are probably best known through several versions of a paper by Leon Kass, to the extent that death is actually good for you, and that extended life would be bad for you, and that you shouldn't want it if you know what's in your best interest. And most of these arguments actually come from late antiquity and from thinkers who wondered whether immortality was good for you. And the problem with all of these arguments is they're about immortality. They're not about extended life, which is not immortality, and which can come to an end when you want to end it, or something else ends it for you, car accident, disease, whatever. So these people argue that it's harder to accept death if you've got extended life. They argue that you acquire courage and other virtues by facing death, that by investing in the next generation and sort of living through your children, you transcend narcissism. That having a normal lifespan means you won't procrastinate, that you'd be bored if you lived forever, and so on. So just to kind of summarize some of the arguments to the contrary, I think the first thing that has to be said is you cannot settle what extended life is going to be like from an armchair. Nobody knows until we live it. It's so radically different from anything else we've seen that my response to this is to say, look, let's just try it out. It's a reversible decision. Okay, if it doesn't work out for you, goodbye, nice knowing you. But there's no reason to simply inhibit the research or prevent this from being developed just because there might be a downside for some people. With boredom, for example, I don't know if I would be bored after 200 years. I have no idea, but I think until boredom is so severe that it's a life worse than death, I'd probably continue choosing extended life. So it may also, for example, be easier to accept death if you've lived a long time and accomplished a lot. Some of these arguments can be flipped in the other direction. Or the point about courage and the virtues. You're still mortal. You can still be rejected. You can still be hurt. You can still be put at risk. All the virtuous characteristics we acquire by facing up to those things, we'll still face up to them in an extended life. They just won't be age-related, right? So I don't think that these arguments are particularly persuasive, but I did have to give considerable attention to them in my book because it's sort of the first thing that you run into. So I mentioned God's offer. What are some of the other arguments in favor of extended life? Well, here's another one. Extended life is in your interest unless it's a life worse than death. Now, how bad does a life have to be worse than death? I think extended life is likely to be a pretty good life. All right, I don't want to be living in a hospital bed forever, right? I see no reason to think it's going to be so bad that I personally would want to pull the plug and let myself age and die. But again, if you find out that it is, you don't have to put a bullet to your brain. You can simply stop using the life extending treatments and resume aging and have the life you would have had if you've never used life extension. You can also play some interesting games with the notion that somehow our existing lifespan's a good one. You can ask what, for example, if it had been half as long, if we didn't live 80 some years, we lived 40 some years, would that be better for us? Well, that seems kind of silly. Or if some virus sped up our rate of aging, would we refuse to take a cure that slows it down? Or if some virus sped up our rate of aging and the only cure available would slow down the rate of aging so much that it would be life extension, which one of those would you choose? So in general, I think if life is good, more life is better. And if you find out that it's not, there's an easy exit. And that's most of what I have to say about the desirability issues. Now, I'm more concerned about the, sorry, I'm shuffling through some papers here, just a second. I'm more concerned about the Malthusian issues. Here we go. Okay. And I was concerned enough, and I was actually pushed on this issue by some students in an audience where I presented on this topic at UC Riverside, and they quite properly pushed back pretty hard. They said, we're not so sure about this stuff. And so I got together with a graduate student in demography. He now has his PhD. He's a demographer. And I said, look, you know the math. Let's figure this thing out, all right? If people live X number of years or X number of centuries, they have X number or Y number of children, how much is the population going to increase over what it would increase now? So we weren't trying to predict what the population is going to be. No one can do that, I don't think. but we tried to at least forecast what it would be given various assumptions. Now, there's two reasons why life extension might add population pressure. One of these is people have more years to have more children. So if it leads to people having a larger number of children than they do now, that of course will add to population pressures. But it turned out that even if they don't do that, there could be population pressures. And this is due to something I call the lingering guest problem. And I use the analogy of a house party with this. So imagine you're throwing a house party for 10 hours. You've invited the entire neighborhood. Your living room will comfortably accommodate about 10 people at a time, maybe 20 if you push it. And you're open for 10 hours, and you're expecting people to drop in randomly in and out during the day and stay an average of an hour each. So the living room will fluctuate between maybe 2 or 3 people, maybe 17, 20 people, but it will be manageable all day long. If your party is a huge success, and everybody who shows up likes it so much they do not leave, then by the end of that 10 hours, you're going to have 100 people in there, far more than the living room can accommodate. So the mathematical problem is that if enough generations hang around longer than they do now, it has an effect on population size, even if our fertility rates are the same. Even if we have, say, 2 children per couple or 2.1 or whatever the replacement fertility rate is. And so my colleague, Shaheen Davidpour, he's now got a position at Northwestern, worked out a very complicated formula. And we said, look, imagine a population of 1 billion people. You can scale it up or down. And let's just assume there's no menopause. Biotech's found a cure for that. Infant mortality is 0. And then we'll make some assumptions about how old women are when they have children. Turns out that with moderate life extension, and this, by the way, is a revision in our view since the book came out, with moderate life extension defined as 120 years, we don't think there's going to be a Malthusian problem with that. Primarily because the percentage of the population that will be of childbearing age will be about 14%, which it is anyway. And so if people live half again as long, that group will be half again as big, but that's the group that would be having children. And so to make a long story short, the resulting increase in the population is not that great. I think we figured out that out of a population of 7 billion, 14% is 1 billion. If they had life extension, that 14% would add just under 500 million people. So not that serious an increase. The real issue comes up with radical life extension. And the reason it arises is because with radical life extension, if you're functionally in your 20s, your 30s, you're going to be fertile indefinitely. Again, I'm assuming there's some way around menopause. We either freeze eggs or we can cure menopause or what have you. And so just to give you a couple of sample figures here, we found, according to our formula, that if people lived an average of 1,000 years, that's how long you would live if you don't age, and the current rate of accidents remained the same. Some would live longer, some would live less, but the average life expectancy would be about 1,000 years. So if that's the average life expectancy, and people have 2 children per woman, or per couple, if you want to put it that way, and the women have the first child at around age 25, and the second child around age 75, the population would increase to 4 times its current level and then stabilize. So if you've got a worldwide population of 10 billion people, and they've all got radical life extension, and they all do this, and they all have 2 children per woman, then you're looking at a 40 billion person population. You can play around with this in a variety of ways. For example, if women have 1.8 children at average birth age of 20, maybe they have one at 19 and one at 21 or something, and people are living 1,000 years, the world's population would increase tenfold in 49 generations, because the age at which women have birth has an impact on how much of a population increase you get. You can, for example, slow down the population increase by having children at later ages. It's an interesting mathematical finding that my colleague Shaheen Davidpour came up with. I'll spare you some of the other statistics. It's in the book at greater length. So we said, all right, look, what's a Malthusian crisis? We decided a Malthusian crisis was an increase beyond what we already expect. A Malthusian crisis would be an increase caused by life extension greater than the increase we expect already. And according to the UN Population Division, we're expecting something like a 1/3 increase over the next several decades. So I said to Shaheen, what would the fertility rate have to be in order to make sure that the population of those who live extended lives isn't more than roughly a third larger than it would have been otherwise. To make a long story short, it depends again on when women have children. So according to Shaheen, if they have an average of 0.5 children, every other woman has one child, and they do it at age 20, you get about a 33% increase over the course of 44 generations, or 33% increase fairly quickly, and then it levels off for a number of generations. That's tolerable, but that's one child for every other woman. If they want to have one child per woman, you could space it out. You could have 1/4 of women have it at age 20, 1/4 have it at age 40, 1/4 at age 800, one at age 900. These are somewhat arbitrary scenarios. And then the population would go up to about 57% increase by the 50th generation. So to make a long story short, we have to do something to think about. This is the leading problem with life extension. Now, I'm still in favor of it. I still think the pros outweigh the cons, but I think we have to think about what we will do if we reach this point. So in the book, I propose a reproductive policy I call forced choice, which is meant to apply only to those who choose to extend their lives. And I won't go through all the details because it's kind of complicated, but I suggest that the way to avoid Malthusian problems would be to require that those who undergo life extension and who extend their lives also agree to limit their reproduction. And there's some ways of keeping track of who's done this and who hasn't. And there's some complications having to do with what happens if you had a kid before you got life extension and so on. I'll kind of spare you all of that. But that's the first real serious moral issue. I think all this focus on whether extended life is a good life to live has distracted us away from the one thing we really need to worry about. Now, the other thing, the other major issue is what I call the justice problem. And I don't think the justice problem is nearly as problematic, primarily because I think eventually the cost of this medical intervention, like any other new technology, is going to drop. And the market for it is as wide as the human race. So I believe it will eventually be possible to make it available for everybody. And it may be that the only way to do that is to let it initially be available just to those who can afford it, because that gets the technology up and running. But I'll just kind of walk you through that, and then I think we're probably ready for a wider discussion. So a lot of people have objected to life extension because they think we're going to have a future where a small minority lives forever and everybody else lives the lives we lead now, and this is a hideous prospect. Well, it's clearly morally unattractive for a lot of reasons. There's an inequality already with wealth, power, and opportunity. That inequality is going to widen if some people have a lot more time to accumulate wealth and pursue opportunities and so forth. It also makes things unequal just in lifespan itself. So it's a morally unattractive scenario. That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is what to do about that scenario. And so there's probably 4 or 5 questions here, but I'll focus on just 2. One question is, should we achieve equality with a guillotine, so to speak, by not letting anybody live longer than the normal lifespan now? Or should we achieve it by trying to make it available to everybody to the extent that we can? And for a lot of reasons, I'm not in favor of inhibiting or prohibiting life extension research, because I think these things have the practical effect of denying life extension to a generation or 2 that might otherwise have had it if the science had proceeded further. So we don't, for example, deny human organs to people because there aren't enough to go around, right? And we shouldn't deny life extension just because there may not be enough money to make it available to everybody. So the first question should be answered this way: if we have to tolerate some inequality for a period of time until we can make it available to everybody, that's the best outcome for the human race in the long run. And any attempt to delay it just means there's some generation that would have had it sooner and doesn't get it, and that's a wrong to those people. Now, the other justice question that sometimes comes up, actually comes up quite often really, is what I call the pressing needs objection. So people often say, well, why are we doing this, right? Some people don't have adequate dental care, they don't have enough food to eat, they're just living on the street and so on. And my answer there is fairly pragmatic, right? We don't deny organs because there aren't enough organs to go around. We don't deny people the ability to build large houses because some people are homeless. And quite frankly, inhibiting or prohibiting life extension, if we could do that, is not going to make the other pressing needs met anyway, right? Just because people don't have life extension doesn't mean the poor will be better fed or the homeless will be housed. If it had that direct a consequence, maybe you could persuade me to say, okay, we'll set life extension aside until we fill the cup from the bottom up and deal with the more serious needs. But preventing life extension from being developed or made available is not going to fill the cup from the bottom up. So I'm not in favor of delaying it for that reason. We live in a morally imperfect world. And those who have the ability to make life extension happen do not typically have the ability to fix the other problems. So I think we should just set that aside as a different set of problems. All right, that largely concludes my overview, and I'm ready to have a larger conversation here.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Davis, for those remarks. You made many excellent observations. And I think what we will do is we will first start with a question from Dr. Jose Cordero, and then we will delve into each of the three areas that you provided an overview of: the desirability questions, the Malthusian questions, and the justice questions. But let us start with Jose.
Well, thank you very much, John. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have not read your book yet, but I just ordered on Amazon. I see that you have it on Amazon, so it's very interesting. And it was published by my alma mater, MIT Press. Since I am an MIT graduate, I believe it must be a very good book to be published by the MIT Press.
Thank you.
Also, I want to tell you I'm very happy that you participated in a previous Transvision conference that we have been organizing. And in fact, the next one is in Madrid, and you are very welcome to come to Spain, either in person or virtually, and everybody else who is watching this. And I have a question or a comment in two parts, because sometimes I think that we have to be more aggressive and ironic about these issues. And you said two things that I share totally, but I am upfront with some people, because I have also written a book called The Death of Death, and I talk about those issues. One is when people say, if we live forever, oh, this is like mandatory, this is a condemnation. You know, I say, no, no. If you want to die, you are free to die. Absolutely. So, I mean, this is not forced, this is not mandatory. So that is the number one issue. The second one is about overpopulation. And I also laugh at that so much, because you even talked about the Malthusian problem. There is no Malthusian problem. In fact, when Malthus talked about that, he thought it was a problem. At the time, London had 1 million people. Great Britain had 10 million people. And the planet had about 1 billion people. And Malthus thought it was the end. It was truly the end. 1 million people in London, 10 million people in England, 1 billion people in the world. This is the end, the end. And what happened? Technology changed, improved. And now London is not 1 million. It's probably close to 10 million. And the United Kingdom is close to 70 million. And the world is close to 8 billion people. And again, there will be another technological change. So that is my point. You know, you have to tell people, I mean, these are non-issues. This is not true. And just like we want to cure cancer, we want to cure Alzheimer's, well, we want to cure aging. But if you don't want to cure it, die of cancer, die of Alzheimer's, or die of aging. That is my answer up front, so that people don't make up these stupid comments.
Well, I agree with your comments about whether, you know, extended life is desirable. I'm right there with you on that one. As far as the Malthusian issue goes, I think there's two different sides to it. One is to ask what the population will in fact be at various life expectancies and numbers of children and birth ages for women. That's just a matter of numbers. So what I try to show with Shaheen Davidpour in the book, and we got another publication coming out later on this, is that if you just run the numbers at this, you know, given life expectancy and a given fertility rate and given ages of birth, here's the numerical answer to how big the population is going to be. That's just a matter of arithmetic. The second side of the issue is that too many? So I think what you're saying is, yeah, we may get a far larger population than we have, but that's not going to be as bad as we think because we've already been through that. You know, London increased tenfold and so on. You know, honestly, I'd like to be wrong about this. I'd like to believe that when people live longer, they say, well, I had a child or two, that was enough, I don't want any more, you know, or that most people will decide not to have kids, or the technological breakthroughs will occur where it'll be possible to have a sustainable world population with an adequate standard of living, you know, at 40 or 50 or 60 billion, if that's what it turns out to. I'd like to be wrong, but I also tend to be a little conservative by nature. I like to plan for the worst. And so I think if we find that the population gets big enough to actually cause problems, we'll then know, well, you know, we got to deal with this. And if technology does not give us the means to solve it, then we're going to have to turn to something else. I guess my own estimate of this is where I'm probably least popular with those who are in favor of life extension. And I know that, but I have to call it as I see it. I think that there is an arithmetical potential here for a really problematic population level, and that we may find it forces choices on us that are uncomfortable. I'd like to be wrong. I'd much rather be wrong than right about that.
John, one little follow-up point. As I said, since Malthus said it was the end of the world, there are 8 times more people. And no problem, no problem. If you fly over Britain, it is empty. So I don't see any problems. But the point is, people who tell me that there are too many people, I say, well, if you truly believe in that, if you are ethical with yourself, then you should give an example and commit suicide, because there are one too many people, and that begins with you. And this is a shock to so many people that they react and they say, oh, maybe, yes, maybe we are not that many. I don't want to die. So tell them that. If you think there are too many, give the example, get rid of yourself, and let the world to the other people who want to live.
I'm not feeling that altruistic myself, but okay.
So Dan Elton has something to say on this.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had come across any of the ideas of the economist Julian Simon, because he has made the argument that innovation is mainly bottlenecked by how many people you have working on the problem, just how many different minds you have, and
yeah.
Therefore, one of the benefits of a larger population is more innovation, which can go about helping with solving some of these scarcity problems. And so I wonder if you've looked at that angle and also thought about like technologies that could be used to scale up food production, things like that, because theoretically, I think we could easily have 40 billion people with dissemination of green agriculture and genetically modified crops and things like that.
Yeah, food and energy, not the things I'm most concerned about. I'm most concerned about the effect of our waste on the ecosystem. But look, again, I'd rather be wrong than right. I don't deny that these things are possible. But I think we also have to think about what happens if this doesn't occur. It's just good prudence to think about what happens if things don't turn out as well as we hope they do, and to think through what we're willing to do about that. So Simon's point, I guess, is that the very technologies which might enable us to deal with a larger population themselves will appear if the population is big enough to have enough minds working on the problem. That may be true. I don't know. But I find myself wondering how large a population would be too large. If people continue having that, I don't think it's likely they'll continue having lots and lots of kids. But theoretically, if they did, if every couple of 100 years they said, I haven't had a baby in a while, I want another one. Okay. Is there some level at which the world's population would be too large? And for me, there is. I don't know if that's true for everyone. But even if 40 billion isn't the level that's too much, theoretically, there's got to be some point at which there's just too many. And eventually, given enough time, I think we would reach it.
So I think this is a good opportunity to bring in some questions and comments from a few of the other panelists and viewers on this question. And I suppose we will address the Malthusian issues first. Alexandria Black asks, might longer lifespans reduce evolutionary pressure to have children? And Jason Geringer on that point remarks that people might not hear that so-called biological clock ticking anymore. So if they're 50 and haven't had children, it won't seem like a big deal, especially if they have an indefinite and quite long lifespan to look forward to. John Halloran writes, quote, I think many people would be voluntarily limiting their fecundity, especially if we can develop extremely reliable and reversible conception control. He says, I think there will be less inclination, let alone pressure, to reproduce among the much longer lived. So do you think it might be possible in that future, if any population concerns are on the horizon, people who are longer lived and long-term oriented might say, well, I don't have to have my next child at 500, I might wait until I'm 800 or 1,000, and perhaps the population situation will ease up. Do you think that having that kind of time will lead people to be a lot more flexible about those kinds of decisions?
I hope so. I've considered that possibility myself, and I think that is one way this thing could turn out. There is a variation of my reproductive policy proposal that would go something like this. You don't have to institute it at the very outset. You don't have to impose it from the day that life extension first becomes available. You could wait until these problems surface and you realize people are not exercising the kind of voluntary limits on reproduction that you're describing. Now, the only downside to that is by that point, the population's already gotten somewhat bigger and some people got to have as many kids as they want. But I can see a case to be made for saying, all right, this is not going to be a popular policy nor an easy one to institute. So why not wait and see if the problem surfaces? And if the problem does surface, then of course a lot of these concerns will be settled. We'll know whether or not there's a problem with the ecosystem. We'll know whether or not the world's too crowded. We'll know whether or not there's a food shortage. We'll know how people are behaving. And I think some of these things are really forecasts of technology and how humans will use it. It's very hard to do that. So I don't have a problem in principle with the idea that we could hold off on a reproductive limit until such time as we see what people are doing and how technology is accommodating population increase. In fact, I think as a practical matter, that's likely to happen anyway. I think there's going to be no political possibility of imposing limits on reproduction from the very outset of life extension. Even if some philosopher thinks it's a good idea, it's not going to happen that way. It's going to happen when enough people see a problem, they want to do something about it. And that would settle a lot of this. If, for example, we find we have starships and colonies in space and so forth, it's another possibility people sometimes mention. Great. If we can solve it that way, I'm all for it. But it may just be that at some point we'll know whether or not there's a problem. And when there's a problem, then we turn to something like the policy I've advocated.
Yes, it seems like a wait and see approach on this matter would be more prudent as life extension treatments become available because of these various opportunities to remedy any current scarcities of resources. And along these lines, Alexandria Black writes, it seems that artificial scarcity affects our notions of how many people can be sustained. And one of the aspects she's alluding to is sometimes resource shortages or apparent resource shortages are not the result of what is possible given the objective production capabilities that we have. It's more an issue of flawed institutions. For instance, there are some dictatorial regimes that withhold food from their citizens in an effort to essentially browbeat them into submission. And that's why there's starvation in many parts of the world. But if that problem were alleviated, there's more than enough food right now to feed those people. Celeste Castaldo points out that clean water is the resource that we would need to master to have a much larger population effectively. But there are technologies already being deployed to solve that problem. And indeed, some of the people we've spoken to on prior virtual Enlightenment salons, like Charles Holsopple of the initiative Suki 222 and Emmanuel Adam Awo Jr. in Ghana, are working on this very problem with low tech but very effective means of bringing clean water filtration systems to those parts of the world. And then John Halloran writes, Elon Musk and others are right, the survival of our species depends upon becoming multi-planetary. So there is the opportunity to expand to space, or we've had conversations with seasteading proponents like Michael Elliott and last week William Otey on this. So building new settlements on the water, perhaps underwater, or using more of the land that we have available, as Jose alluded to. So what do you think of a concerted effort to push outward the boundaries of that scarcity, perhaps preceding any attempts to limit the population so that we never run up against any hard resource constraints?
Yeah, I think what I want to say is, in a way, we're in, I'll put this in quotes, a kind of quasi and Malthusian crisis right now. We already have sustainability issues. We already have people who aren't fed, and we're working on those problems. So we're going to have to solve these problems whether life extension comes along or not. And we've got to find sustainable clean energy. We've got to find a way to produce enough food. We've got to find enough clean water for everybody. And so all the things that would need to be done to accommodate the kind of population growth life extension might cause need to happen anyway. They need to happen right now. And people are working on this, and God bless them. I wish them the best. I think it's magnificent what they're doing. So yeah, maybe we'll find we can accommodate. Again, I'd love to find that we can. But I think that the core point I wanted to make in the chapter of my book about the Malthusian thing was simply, if you run the arithmetic numbers, what you find are population levels that are much larger than we've ever seen before. And that's what we need to think about, whether that kind of a population is sustainable, whether we want a population of that level, whether that would ever be problematic. I will also say, by the way, as we're having this conversation, if I were to make a change in that part of my book, and maybe I would, now that you're pressing me on this, I would probably give more discussion to the possibility of a wait and see version of my policy and the ethical issues that might raise, because I may be skeptical about about the possibility of technology solving all these problems, but I could also be wrong. And so it would be worthwhile thinking through the ethics of deferring a reproductive limit until we find out one way or the other what the answer is.
Yes, thank you for that response. And I'm glad that you have a nuanced position on these issues, because I think that can speak to a lot of people who primarily express skepticism of life extension because of population concerns. But again, it's not a binary issue, and population doesn't skyrocket overnight. There is an article from the early 2000s by Max Moore called Super Longevity Without Overpopulation, in which he points out data stating that if everybody became immortal tomorrow, which is essentially the most extreme scenario, the rate of population growth would still be lower than it was during the baby boom in the mid 20th century. So humankind has been there already, at least in the initial phase, and yet we have been able to adjust to it and still have extraordinary economic growth and growth in material standards of living for 7 decades hence. So clearly, if this becomes a problem, it won't become a problem until later than that, and perhaps we'll have enough lead time to address that.
Yeah, the calculations that Shaheen Davidpour ran suggested under some scenarios, the issue could arise in about 3 or 4 generations, but that's still 3 or 4 generations. That's several decades. So it's not an overnight thing by any means. I also appreciate your point about a nuanced position. I want to say something in general, because I think with this audience, we're talking amongst the converted, right? I think probably most or everyone tuning in already thinks life extension is a pretty good idea. But we have to bear in mind what's required to talk to the audience beyond the screen. And I've talked to a variety of different kinds of audiences. And I think just as a matter of rhetoric and persuasion, you've got to acknowledge their concerns and you've got to be prepared to address them. So when I run into people who think extended life is not good for you, I try to see whatever there is to be said in favor of their position and then respond to that. And the biggest objection I run into, biggest two objections, would be the justice problem, but also the Malthusian thing. And it's a deeply held concern by lots of people. I think if you want to persuade the general public that life extension is a good idea, I don't know if invoking, technology as the solution is going to convince everybody. You've got to be able to address their concerns. And so.
Yes, and that's a valid point too, because people come to these discussions with a certain frame of mind. And if they are concerned about overpopulation or any set of issues, it's likely that a single argument won't persuade them. It will just nudge them a little bit in one direction or another. And acknowledging the legitimacy of their concerns helps with that, helps keep them in the discussions.
Yeah.
Now, we have some interesting observations in the chat from Didier Cornell. He says, with the rhythm that we have at the moment in most countries, if people stop to die of old age, we will only have a problem in 50 years or more. Where people live longer, they have less children. That's his empirical observation. And we have largely enough at the moment to already support at least 10 billion people. And finally, people will be more careful about the environment if they know they will live for centuries. And this is a point that I do think needs to be emphasized, especially to people who express these Malthusian concerns, because it's a question of the time horizon. If you think you'll live for thousands of years, you will care more about what will happen to the planet, to the sustainability of various systems, both biological and man-made, in millennia from now, as opposed to if you only had a 30-year time horizon or a 50-year time horizon. Do you think this kind of argument is going to be persuasive to a lot of people with regard to expressing how this will change the incentives of humans who are much longer lived?
I hope it's persuasive. I think it's a damn good argument, and I fully agree with it. And I think the point needs to be made early and often. Yeah, I think one thing we need to bear in mind is that if we live long enough, we might grow up to a degree we don't currently. Especially if we're in good health and we're approaching life, not as somebody facing the end, but as somebody who's got another umpteen decades to go. We may find that we care more about posterity. We may find we become less materialistic because we learn those things don't really make us as happy as we think they're going to, above a certain level of income. We may find we want peace more than war because we've got so much to lose, so many years of life to lose. So I think we have to, I really do believe that life extension could produce a wiser humanity, a race of beings that just is wiser than we are now, just because they have enough time to get that way. I don't think we should assume that the kind of people we are in our 30s, 40s, and 50s is what we would be like 100, 200, 300 years longer than that. And I think we might very well find that people care a lot about the environment if they expect to live into it, 500, 1,000 years from now.
Yes, indeed. And I think this would be a good bridge into a conversation that you had with Jason Crawford in 2020 on the net impacts of technology and whether the net impacts of technology are beneficial, at least whether they have been in the status quo. And the concern that you expressed in that conversation was that although on net technology has improved human standards of living thus far, it has also raised the stakes and increased the risks, say the risk of nuclear annihilation and potential other emerging risks. And it is for this reason that transhumanists care a lot about existential risks. And for instance, the US Transhumanist Party advocates for nuclear disarmament, since nuclear annihilation is the most proximate existential risk to our species at present. So with greatly extended longevity, do you think human beings will take the time to consider those risks and study philosophy more systematically, have that longer term time horizon, and have our wisdom catch up to our technological prowess so that on net, technology will continue to be beneficial and those risks actually decline, at least to some asymptote going forward?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it would help. Let me just kind of recap some of my thoughts on this for the audience here. Yeah, I felt like I had noticed, and maybe I have, a kind of trend. It seemed like problems posed by technology seem to be becoming more serious and more numerous over the last few decades. And I thought, well, why is this happening? And I finally decided the problem was not with technology. And by the way, what kinds of technology? Well, climate change, nuclear weapons, the fake news epistemic crisis we're having right now. I could go on. Automation and unemployment. Why is this happening? And I finally decided there's a few reasons. One is that technology continues to make us more powerful. One is that many new technologies are not under collective control because of miniaturization and other factors. They can be used by individuals or small groups without societal oversight. And one is the pace of technology is increasing, especially now with AI and machine learning and so on. But the real problem, I decided, is that we as a species are not evolved for the kinds of powers that we have now. We evolved probably in the last ice age. So strangers were enemies, you killed them maybe, right? Food you ate as soon as you got it, you didn't worry about cholesterol. You didn't plan for the long run because really the next day was the future. You couldn't really control much beyond that. You certainly couldn't affect the ecosystem. And human societies tended to be small, 20, 30, 40 people in a band of hunter-gatherers. So we have a set of cognitive heuristics that incline us towards short-term self-interest that make perfect sense in a landscape of stone spears and woolly mammoths, but doesn't work real well for a global, planetary, high-tech civilization with the power of a god. Right. And so I think one thing that can be done about that is to try to find a way for us to be more wise. And by more wise, I would say, well, my definition of wisdom is making choices you won't regret. And that's why it correlates with age. The longer you live, the more you know about how choices turn out. So I think a population of people who've lived a long, long time are going to think more about long-term interests because they expect to live to see them. I hope they'll think more about everybody's collective good just because they will have lived long enough to realize that we all benefit if we all benefit together. I hope they will become more wise. And so, yeah, I think life extension would probably ameliorate some of the concerns that I raised in my discussion with Jason Crawford, definitely.
All right, thank you for that response. And I think a lot of the conversation that has been happening has created the opportunity for a bridge into the justice questions as well, although we can continue addressing the Malthusian questions as they interact with the justice questions. But we have a question from Celeste Castaldo, who writes, Professor Davis, how do you see the access to life extension options currently in the US and the world? You mentioned stem cell therapies as one of the technologies you expected to contribute to life extension. And we currently do have stem cell therapies available in the US and other parts of the world. Indeed, I would add sometimes stem cell clinics prefer to locate outside of the US because they're not subject to as much stringent regulation from entities such as the Food and Drug Administration, which tend to be overcautious in my view. So the stem cell clinics have more opportunities to experiment in other countries. For instance, Colombia is a hub for stem cell treatments, and there are other countries in Latin America as well. So what would you say about the current state of access, at least to cutting edge research treatments that may be experimental and may or may not prolong life, but at least people can try them?
Yeah, well, I think clearly we can't make them available to very many people right now. They're far too expensive. And I think that's going to be true for quite a while. I suppose here I'm going to invoke my own faith in technology and say that when you look at complex technologies, they do tend to come down in cost over time, especially if you can automate them in some way. And automation, I'm working on a book on automation right now, and I'm learning that all sorts of things can be automated. We didn't think it'd be automated. Maybe the production of stem cell therapy would be one of them. But if you look at the cost of whether it's cell phones, TVs, pocket calculators, they came down dramatically over time. You go to a third world country and you walk past a hut, you might see a flat screen TV in there. I've seen this. So I think there's every reason to believe that however expensive these interventions are, they will come down in price at some point, enough that a wealthy society at least can make them available to those who aren't able to afford them. I can easily imagine somebody taking out a loan. If you're going to live for another 500 years, you can pay that money back, right, out of your income, presumably. So I think we shouldn't assess this by how expensive these things are now. Because if you assess the whole problem by how things are right now, well, right now we don't have life extension. So I think we have to think about what these technologies are going to be like. We've had enough time and a large enough market to bring the cost down quite a bit.
Yes, indeed. And I certainly concur with you on that. We have often made arguments from the US Transhumanist Party standpoint about the trajectory that most emerging technologies follow, where initially they are quite expensive and available to only a few, but in an accelerating fashion over time, they become more affordable and more reliable until they're essentially practically free, like internet access is today for many people throughout the world. Now, Luis Arroyo makes a great point with regard to those who assert that we need to focus on the direst problems of the least fortunate first, and that is, metaphorically, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. John Halloran points out that it's never going to be that we address problems in their so-called proper order. Progress has never been and likely never can be orderly in that way. There will always be competing values and demands on individual and group resources, and Luis Arroyo agrees with that. He says progress will never be equal or orderly, but we can give it our all as a species to address the issues that exist today and will exist tomorrow. So this is essentially an argument of why not do everything? Why not try to alleviate the problems of the least fortunate at the same time push outward the boundaries of progress?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we can walk and chew gum. I think if society had the kind of discipline and altruism that it would take to fill the glass from the bottom up and deal with all these needs, the needs wouldn't be there anymore, right? It's not going to happen. And delaying life extension until that happens is just delaying life extension indefinitely. So I think for the very good points that these various participants have made, and also the reasons I gave, I don't think the pressing needs objection is a very good objection. If nothing else, and I want to go back to the issue about the cost of this for a second. If you look at incomes around the world, there's a rising tide of prosperity. The percentage of the human race living in real poverty is getting dramatically smaller. There's been striking progress made at raising incomes around the world. So even as the cost of the technology is falling, incomes are rising. So a lot of these pressing needs, I think, will eventually be dealt with just through rising prosperity. And those people who now have more money are going to want life extension, which I hope will be affordable to them by then.
Yes, indeed. And there was a comment from Alexandria Black, who wrote, "A thriving population looks more sustainable than a miserable population." And this, I think, is also connected to the Malthusian questions. So people who have higher incomes, higher standards of living, they also take more responsibility because they value their lives more, they get more out of them. And so you see in societies with rising standards of living, also the desire to protect the environment or reduce pollution rise as well. And a certain degree of concern for other people. In many less developed societies throughout history, there has been the sense that, oh, the poor will always be with us, and it may not be let's say a pleasant sight, but we just need to accept that that's the reality. Whereas today, even in many advanced societies, there's this idea that nobody should be homeless, nobody should be below a certain baseline, and we should try to help lift people up, that these are problems that are solvable. Now, Alexandria also has a question, and I have a bit of my own perspective on that question, but I'd be interested in yours as well. So she asks, why would the rich let life extension trickle down? Jason Geringer responds, the rich don't let anything, quote, trickle down. And Alexandria asks, so what ensures that it gets democratized? Now, my interpretation of the rich don't let anything trickle down is that the rich don't really have that ability, so to speak. It's not like the wealthiest people in the world had the option to say, well, we only want cell phones for ourselves, and these will be the large, cumbersome bricks, but they'll be status symbols. We won't let anybody else have them. But the dynamics of the market of technological innovation led it to be the case that within a few decades, cell phones became ubiquitous. And likewise, anything that is seen as a status symbol even, or seen as available to the rich, is going to be coveted by many other people to the extent that somebody will find a way to deliver it. Do you have the same or similar views on this, and how would you respond to this trickle down argument?
Well, I think what the rich will not let trickle down is their wealth. But what the rich do like to do is sell things. And so this plays in two ways. Number one, if they do develop, and it looks like the Silicon Valley billionaires are out ahead of the pack here. So if anybody develops it, it may be them. What are they going to want to do? Just keep it for themselves? No, they don't want to make money. They're going to sell it like they sell software or everything else. And the other point is the rich tend to like to have a larger market. So a lot of the concerns about the possibility of population decline around the world right now are coming from people who are worried that capitalism is unsustainable if the number of consumers is shrinking, right? Well, one way to increase the population or base of consumers is to make life extension widely available, so that you would have people living longer are going to buy more things, right? So I don't think there's any reason to think they'll hold it back. I do worry a little bit about what happens if the basic research is being done by private entities. I hope they will make it publicly available in peer-reviewed journals. I hope they will have something like an institutional review board for protecting human subjects. I hope they will make it available without squeezing people economically so hard that nobody can afford this stuff. But I don't think they're going to hoard it. It's not economically in their interest to do that. They're not better off if they keep us all living 80, 90 years apiece. They're better off if they let us buy this product from them.
Yes, indeed. And I am of the view that a combination of philanthropy and private enterprise is the best way forward with this. And of course, there's room for governmental organizations like the National Institutes of Health doing basic research and academia doing basic research, but there are certain limitations of those kinds of pursuits to translate to direct applications to human patients unless there is both a philanthropic sector and a for-profit sector. But interestingly enough, right now within the life extension community, there is a bit of I would say some controversy and a set of differences about which of these elements should be emphasized. And for a long time, the thought leader in this field has been Dr. Aubrey de Grey, who is very much a proponent of the philanthropic approach. He co-founded both the Methuselah Foundation and the SENS Research Foundation, and he points out there's this valley of death where the for-profit investors, they don't see an immediate return, and the governmental and academic institutions would see this kind of research as departing too far from basic science, so still too applied, but the fruits of this research may be born perhaps 10, 20, 30 years from now. Nonetheless, this is crucial research to actually get to longevity escape velocity. So organizations like the Methuselah Foundation, the SENS Research Foundation have been funding this research for a long time, but there also seems to be a faction within the longevity community that is trying to kind of corporatize everything, make everything into a startup, make everything into a kind of closed source enterprise where essentially the research will be proprietary and will be sold very expensively. And granted, the arguments that this technology cannot be kept closed for long, but people like Aubrey de Grey have had concerns that essentially, at least initially, this could lead to setbacks where a lot of investors come in seeking easy money and then they change the direction of the research to something shorter term. And by the way, for those who are wondering, a lot of the other controversies in the longevity community can be explained by this difference in the tension that it involves. So what do you think about perhaps the balance of approaches within the field that would get us to the point of maximal access to as many people as possible as soon as possible?
Wow. So I guess the claim some people are making is the more proprietary closed shop kind of approach might make these things available faster because the immediate profits are greater. Honestly, I don't know. I kind of lean towards Aubrey's point of view here. I am concerned about exactly that possibility, and I'm afraid that it would slow down the dissemination of this research. I much prefer Aubrey's approach. And I hope that the research doesn't get privatized to the point where nothing's peer reviewed, and the basic research isn't available anywhere. But I don't know that I have anything very constructive to say, except that I share his concern. It's not like a real concern to me.
Yes, and I do as well. And actually, up until now, the longevity community has been characterized by a remarkable openness and collaboration. And a lot of the research has been peer-reviewed and published, including by journals where Aubrey had been the editor or one of the main editors until very recently. And I think for those in the longevity community, it's important to watch this space because I believe people like Aubrey are absolutely essential to maintain that kind of open and collaborative approach. And again, there can and should be startups and investors and private corporations, but they should exist within this ecosystem where philanthropy is a big part of it and grassroots participation is a big part of it. And we should support those kinds of tendencies as well.
Yeah, I think it may help too if the FDA finally recognizes aging as a disease, which would remove some of the barriers to more conventional research on this by pharmaceutical companies that would make money from this the way they do with any other drug. I had another thought, I forget what it was, but what the heck was I thinking? I don't know.
Well, recognition of aging as a disease has also been a major priority of the US Transhumanist Party. Some of our foreign ambassadors have been in conversations with governments of various countries and cities, and we think it will take one government somewhere to recognize aging as a disease, and then there could be a domino effect that will be triggered. And it doesn't so much matter which government does it, because others will look at this and ask, well, why did they do that? What could be the benefits from the standpoint of tourism and investment and positioning our jurisdiction as a research hub as a place that's seen as innovative? So I hope one country or city or state somewhere will take up this idea and issue a declaration for the recognition of aging as a disease. So yes, I think we are quite aligned on this matter. Now, I would like to ask anybody on the panel if you have any questions or comments on either the Malthusian issues or the justice issues. And after we do that, we'll weave in some of the desirability questions as well. Jose, please proceed.
Yes, again, fantastic discussion. And I want to congratulate you, Gennady, for organizing and John for speaking today. My question continues on Dan Elton's comment about Julian Simon. I am a big admirer of Julian Simon, and he actually won the bet against the other Stanford professor that I don't want to name because I forget the name right now. Paul Ehrlich.
Yes.
Yes. But anyway, my point is people think that we are liabilities. We are assets. We humans, and that is why civilization has improved and advanced so much in the last 2 centuries, because we are just more people, more brains. And I like to say, we just don't come with a mouth and a behind to eat and destroy. We come with a brain, and the brain as far as we know, is the most complex structure in the known universe, Maybe in the future, we will find some Martians or other beings with bigger brains, more intelligent than us. But until now, this that we have here is the most complex structure in the universe. Why have we advanced so much? Because we are more people. Actually, we need more people. I think we should have 1 trillion people. Anyway, we are just going to begin colonizing the universe. We need more people. So that to me is a non-argument. We need more people. We come with brains, not just mouths and asses.
All right, thank you, Jose. Any other questions or comments from the panel?
Yeah, that was a really good point, Jose. I mean, that is a lot of the reason why we are progressing faster and faster and faster. And, you know, also life extension, you know, we got humans will live, we don't start getting productive till we're like 20. And then when we're like 65, then we're off on the other end. And, you know, so there's only this small point in between where we're really productive to society. Well, life extension will, you know, it's not making more young people and more old people. It's making more people that are in the middle that are more productive. So, you know, and also it takes like almost 40 years to just get to be a wise individual. And so all of these people that are living longer will all be these wiser individuals. And it's hard to even estimate how wise even the individual will get if we're allowed to live longer. You know, and the other thing, if you was to do the thought experiment about and say that there are aliens in the universe, and even say that they're maybe even watching us, you know, like in the Star Trek universe, they have the prime directive in that they don't interfere with lower civilizations until they reach warp drive. Well, you know, I would think that it, you know, in the thought experiment, if it's true that there are aliens, I would think that they would be waiting for us to get life extension instead of warp drive. Because I mean, think about it. If we're almost to having this technology, then we can assume that a more advanced civilization already has it. So that means they're long-lived. So, and think about it, what it must be like to come down and try to teach somebody, you know, as soon as you teach somebody and get them up to speed, well, they die, you know? So it would be like, what's the point? You know, I would think that they would be waiting for us to live long enough to where it even, you know, is worth talking to them about it. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. Back to you.
All right. So Celeste Castaldo has a question. Do you see a movement for more research in academia towards life extension? And she suggests that perhaps the California universities can lead the way toward increased academia involvement in research focused on life extension. And of course, you're more familiar with the situation in California universities, and California is a hub for startups and innovative technological entrepreneurship. Do you see that reflected in the academic atmosphere at all?
You know, I don't know. My academic career started about 20 years ago. And I'm in philosophy, of course, which is some distance from a lot of this stuff. But, you know, I know a little bit about what's been going on in the last 30, 40 years. And I think the answer to the question is, yes, there is movement in academia towards life extension. I think it's being taken seriously in a way that was not the case 30 years ago. I think people are talking about it more and more. I think the fact that the NIH now has a working group that's basically about life extension is a very good sign. And although I realize Google is not academia, it is a source of research money. And the fact that Calico is out there, the fact Jeff Bezos wants to put money into this, in an extended sense of academia, yeah, I think there's definitely more focus on this. I think that the more this is worked on, the more people will want to work on it. It will accelerate eventually. So I hope, anyway.
Yes, thank you. And I share that hope as well. Alexandria Black points out that Dr. Michael Rose, one of the leading researchers on life extension, who has extended the lifespans of fruit flies, essentially at least fourfold, he is at UC Irvine. And I've met him on numerous occasions as well. So he's definitely a great contributor to the field. Now, Alexandria also points out that nature has created many medicines that can't be patented, and there are also some medicines that are off patent right now because they've been in existence for a long time, like metformin, for instance.
Yeah.
So one of the difficulties in a recent FDA-approved trial called TAME, targeting aging with metformin, has been in raising funding, which again had to be done primarily from philanthropic individuals and organizations because there's no patent behind metformin. And so a lot of for-profit corporations aren't interested in bankrolling the trial. So what are your thoughts on how we can incentivize more research in this field with low cost, either naturally available or long existing interventions that could potentially extend lifespan if they're tested rigorously enough and applied in certain ways?
I confess I've never thought about that. I thought primarily about the fact that if FDA did consider aging a disease, that would provide some incentive for a lot of this. But as to things that are off-label or already out there, just off the top of my head, I would think one thing that could be done would be a revision to patent law that allows companies to reacquire intellectual property rights over, let's say, metformin for purposes of a life extension application if they prove the application is possible. You could say, okay, you didn't develop metformin, but you showed a new use for metformin, and to give you an incentive to show that this new use exists, we'll give you a patent for 20 years or whatever it is over any sale of metformin with life extension applications. Or you could give them, a percentage of the metformin market. You try to estimate what percentage of the total market is going to life extension and give them, a patent right or, royalty rights over that percentage of the market would be another way to do it. Yeah, I think the answer probably lies in patent law as well as the FDA.
Now, we've had issues with patent law before where some patents were granted to companies for discovering new applications of drugs, but that has unfortunately had the effect of greatly raising the prices of those drugs or devices because there is reduced competition. And of course, with less competition, there's an incentive for more exclusive producers to increase their prices and harvest as much profit as they can while they can. So wouldn't a better approach be, instead of creating any sort of exclusive rights, grant a bounty of some sort to the company that discovers the application? And if it's an application of metformin, perhaps this could come from a governmental agency. It will say, well, metformin should still be cheaply available and produced by many people, but because you made this discovery, we'll give you $20 million outright, or whatever amount can incentivize that kind of discovery.
That might actually be a better approach. Yeah, rather than giving them the exclusive right to sell metformin for life extension, because after all, you can always buy metformin for some other purpose and use it for life extension. Maybe it would be better, as you suggest, just to give them some share of the market as a kind of reward. So I think my royalty suggestion might work out like that. If you say to company X, well, you've shown metformin works with life extension in the following way, okay, you now get to charge some percentage of all metformin sales and keep it low enough that the drug does not become fabulously expensive for everybody else. And that would just be the price of developing this new application. That might be a better solution.
All right, so we have Thomas Orm raising his hand. Please proceed with your question.
Yeah, hi. My question was, how much money is currently invested in life extension that you know of, like radical life extension? Is it above or below $1 billion? And why isn't one of these billionaires just donating several $1 billion out of their own, massive fortune to get this going as kind of a moonshot project?
Well, I think Gennady probably knows the details of this a bit better than I do, but I think the answer is it's happening. Last time I looked, Calico, California Life Company, which is founded by Google, is meant to do precisely this. And I think they had an initial investment of something like $2.3 billion. And there may be more than that. They're not particularly open about their funding. I don't know how much money Bezos is going to put into this, but he's got plenty. But presumably it's going to be a lot, especially if he thinks he's going to benefit from it. So I think it's happening. I don't know what the total dollar figure is. I have no idea. I tried to pin that down when I wrote my book. It's really very hard to figure out what it is.
I guess they still seem to be rather hesitant and shy about just, announcing to the world that they're going to, quote, conquer death, or at least radically extend our lives. It seems like a project that they would be very ostentatious about and saying, we're going to do this. They're doing it with their SpaceX or their space projects, but is it the whole religious thing that they're worried that there's going to be a great backlash if they go down the road of extending life and then piss off all the religious community that and those various forces that have been invested in having an afterlife, and death is a moneymaker for a lot of people, ironically.
Well, a couple of comments. I think they are pretty open about what they're doing. Bezos was in the news just recently on this. There's nothing shy about Silicon Valley billionaires. They have no problem telling us what's on their mind when they want to do that. But as far as religiosity goes, I just wanted to say there have been some surveys, and some of the surveys cited in my book, where they see whether opposition to life extension or concerns about it correlate with religiosity. Turns out it doesn't. There's no correlation one way or the other with religiosity. I thought there would be, but there is not, interestingly enough.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes. And thank you to Thomas for his questions. It has also been my observation that religious affiliation doesn't seem to affect support for life extension. Now, a lot of transhumanists are atheists or not traditionally religious, but I think a lot of that has had to do with the communities and subcultures in which transhumanism began to flourish. And I myself am an atheist, but I have found that, of course, religions and theologies can be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. And it's more the temperament or the disposition of the individual that will determine how a particular religious framework is going to be interpreted. So we have Christian transhumanists, Jewish transhumanists, Buddhist transhumanists, some Muslim transhumanists, even though I would say more Muslim transhumanists in the Western world than in the Middle East. But I think this also is a good bridge to the desirability questions and the comment you made about adaptive preferences. And one of our viewers, Scott, pointed out that people are often hesitant to express hope for something they don't think is possible. And I think a lot of philosophical systems and religious systems, and they don't have to be religious, they could be Stoicism, for instance, have led people throughout the millennia to try to reconcile themselves with what they consider to be inevitable. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy comes to mind, and he was writing kind of in the direst time for Western civilization. He was about to be executed. The Roman world was collapsing everywhere. The Dark Ages were beginning. There wasn't that much hope. The only thing he could do was kind of find some equanimity and solace in philosophical contemplation as he was facing death. But a lot of that way of thinking has carried forward, even though we humans now have a much greater prospect of actually overcoming this problem within our lifetimes. So what would you say drives these adaptive preferences, and particularly the differential prevalence of them. So some people are more techno-optimistic. They think that life extension is worth pursuing. Other people tend to have more of a status quo bias and have really absorbed these historic rationalizations. What traits differentiate one group from the other?
This is pure speculation, but I'll put it out there as a hypothesis available for testing. I think it may partly have to do with envy. One of the toughest positions to be in for many people is going to happen over the next 20, 30, 40 years. If you live long enough to realize life extension is coming, and you realize that train will not get to the station until you're dead, that's going to be very tough for people to live with. Or you see it coming to the billionaires and the millionaires, and you realize you can't get it. And so I think one source of adaptive preferences has got to be anxiety over the very fact that it might appear. It may not be so much death that we're worried about, but the lack of availability of life extension that people are worried about. I gave a talk once, several years ago, to a group of philosophers who had read one of the draft chapters of my book. It was about the desirability of life extension. And I made all the arguments, and in philosophy, what you're supposed to do if you disagree with somebody is explain where their argument went wrong. Is there a false premise? Is the argument invalid such that the conclusion does not follow? Do you have a counterexample? Is there a thought experiment? There's a way the game is played. Well, most, if not all of them, said they didn't want life extension. Okay, fine. What's wrong with my arguments? I couldn't get anything out of them. They just flatly refused to engage. And I couldn't help but feel like some of it was just that they knew they weren't going to get it. And they don't want to think about the availability of something that might happen. The real scary thing might not be death. The real scary thing might be that some people won't die and you're not going to be one of them. So I think there's that, and that problem may get worse. I also think it's just very difficult for people to think about a radically new situation. I grew up reading and watching tons of science fiction. And I noticed a lot of you did the Vulcan reading thing there. I grew up on that stuff. I love that stuff. And I always thought it was really interesting that in science fiction, you very rarely see life extension scenarios. There's a few. You see colonies in other worlds, you see faster than light travel, you see collective hive minds of multiple creatures, all sorts of interesting things, but you don't see life extension. And I think the human condition has been built around a predictably limited lifespan for so long that when that changes, it's going to be one of the 4 or 5 big changes the human race has ever seen, along with literacy, science and technology, agriculture, development of cities. It's huge. And I think that level of change is just a lot for people to adjust to. So that may be some of this also.
Yes, indeed. And these are definitely plausible explanations for why some people are reluctant to overcome the status quo bias and embrace the possibility of indefinite life extension. So Celeste Castaldo has given us a very generous super chat. Thank you very much, Celeste. And she believes this conversation is number one. I like it very much as well. I think it's quite enjoyable, and we always appreciate our viewers and how involved they are. So one of our viewers, Sergei Gutkin, asks, do you think there's any chance for people currently in their 70s and 80s to avoid dying of old age? And this is a serious question in his mind, because if transhumanism doesn't give people in their 70s and 80s enough time for hope, then some will indeed object to something they will not live to, and not necessarily everyone. So for instance, John Halloran writes in the chat that he's 68 and he doesn't object. And I know a lot of leading life extensionists. Ray Kurzweil now, I believe, is 72. Dr. Bill Andrews will be turning 70 soon. And Natasha Vita-Moore is 70. So all of these individuals, they still harbor a hope of living indefinitely. So do you believe this is a realistic hope for them, and that this could potentially be used to motivate others who are currently more advanced in their years, who may have more resources, more societal influence, but to get them on board with this project?
I would never dismiss it. I mean, I said in my book, I don't believe I'm going to get it myself. I'm 65. I think it's going to take a while for this thing to be developed. But no, I think there is a possibility. And I think one of the reasons for this is I believe that if we learn to slow aging, we should be able to in effect reverse it. If a lot of the age-related changes we go through can be partly reversed just by slowing the process of aging, then it may be that we can even reverse aging. I wouldn't rule that out. So if somebody's 75 and they live to be 85, and at 84 something becomes available, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they might slowly, sort of restore their youthful vigor. What are the odds of that? I don't know. I fear they're not great, because I think it just takes longer to do something like this than we might realize. And I wish I could be more optimistic about the pace of this, but I think working out the practical applications is going to be tough. There appear to be quite a few different processes of aging, and getting all those different processes to work the way we want them to without undesirable side effects or intolerable side effects may take a while.
And fair enough, this is a complex problem. And this is why Aubrey de Grey points out that repairing the various types of damage through an engineering approach will be a lot easier than understanding all of the metabolic processes and intervening in them to slow down aging. So perhaps that will come a lot sooner. What do you think of cryonics as a main line of approaching people who are in their 70s and 80s today and telling them, well, you may still have a chance? Granted, that too is an experimental procedure, but at least your body will not be destroyed. And when future technologies are made available to lead you to be cured of whatever ailments you have now, your body will be in sufficiently good shape that the preservation can be reversed somewhere hundreds of years down the road, and you'll be able to live again.
I think it's a rational choice. I had a conversation once with Aubrey about this and a few other things, and I know that he's in favor of something like that. I think it's a rational choice. I don't know how persuasive it will be as an argument directed at, skeptics. This reminds me, by the way, if I can just digress for half a second here, of something else Aubrey told me during that conversation. There's a Silicon Valley billionaire, and I forget which one, and I probably shouldn't say, but if I did remember, who went to his father. His father's a very wealthy man, and said, "Dad, I'm raising money for life extension. Would you like to contribute?" And the father said, "No. I'm not going to get this. Why should I put any money into it?" It just seems like a rather cold thing to do, but apparently, So I think you do have to be prepared to talk to people of all ages. But I think realistically, you're playing a numbers game. I don't know what the odds are if you freeze your head or your entire body that at some point you'll wake up, it'll be a bright light and it'll be Earth, in the year 2300 or whatever, and you're back. I don't know what the odds are that in 5 or 10 years, there'll be a version of life extension available that I can take advantage of. I would never rule out the possibility. I have to say, based on what's happening right now, I feel like it's not a high probability. And that's just my assessment.
Yes, and I hope you're mistaken in that assessment, because I don't want to be part of the first generation to receive radical life extension treatments. I want to be part of the second or third generation to receive radical life extension treatments, because I know that the first treatments will be experimental and there may be some issues or side effects to be worked out. But the more advanced this technology becomes, the more empirical data there emerges as a result of a lot of patients going through those treatments, the more reliable they will be. So I hope by the time I need to reverse my senescence, these treatments will be so ubiquitous that you can go in the clinic. It's a fairly well-known procedure. The risks are also well-known and under control. And that way it will just be part of one's routine medical care. So that's my incentive for people in their 70s and 80s to receive those kinds of treatments. Now, Ben Ballweg has a question, so please proceed.
John, thanks for being here today. I wanted to ask more. You mentioned about taking it to your class about the Malthusian concerns about life extension. I guess you piqued my curiosity about what class that was and how you even proposed that class and the contents within to your administrators, and what kind of pushback you got about trying to teach such a class? And then I guess I wanted to bring that back to how did you overcome their skepticism about teaching about it, about life extension's possibility, et cetera?
Sure. Well, the class was at UC Riverside. I actually wasn't the teacher. A friend of mine who's a philosopher taught it. He took the existing course in medical ethics. It's a fairly common course on campuses. I teach it at Cal State Fullerton. He just decided to build the entire course around life extension. And the way American universities work, you have the latitude to do that. You can, as long as you're loosely connected to the course description, you can teach pretty much what you want to. I could do something similar at Cal State Fullerton. And he had me in as a guest lecturer, actually. And I think he said I could work on any topic I wanted to. I chose the Malthusian issue because I was working on it at that time, and I wanted to test my ideas out on the audience. And I was surprised at how much pushback I got from young people. They didn't like the idea of life extension, and the stated reason was concerns about the environment. And it really pushed me to go back and think about it again and find a demographer to work with. But I think we may see more and more courses on this, or sections of courses on this. First time I ever taught medical ethics, which was back in the 90s, I had a section on life extension. I just put it in for fun at the end. It's not easy to find a lot of philosophical writings on the topic. They're out there, but there's not an abundance of material on this the way there is in some bioethical questions. That's the main obstacle.
Yes, thank you. And it is quite interesting because a lot of today's young people, they do seem to have a certain general sense of life, of existential dread and pessimism, because they've been taught that they need to be alarmed about climate change, for instance, and other environmental issues. And they've been raised in the post-September 11th world. They have not experienced what life was like before September 11th, 2001. And I wonder, how would it be possible to communicate to them the, I suppose now older sense in Western societies that problems are solvable? And we've had great existential crises before, the risk of nuclear annihilation, which I pointed out, which peaked during the Cold War. We've had world wars before. We've had famines, civil wars, various kinds of problems that humans did overcome through technology and rationality and diplomacy. What can convince young people today that this is also an option for climate change and other concerns that they may have?
Well, I think in whatever course those topics are included, you have to point out the possible solutions. I think it almost never does any good to talk about a problem unless you're also prepared to discuss a possible solution. I had a housemate once who was an engineer. He said something that may be a proverb from somewhere, I don't know. He said, problems by definition can be solved. Anything that cannot be solved is not a problem, it's a fact of life. And I think there's something to that. I think one of the reasons I was driven to talk about reproductive policy with the Malthusian issue is that I think if you're going to persuade young people, number one, you got to take their concerns seriously. Number two, you've got to offer a possible solution. And I'm perfectly happy if part of the possible solution is technological advances, but you also have to offer some other ways of solving this. And I don't know what to say to young people. I see a comment here from Alexandria about young people living in the moment. I think that's been a trait of young people all along. I can remember when I was in my 20s, I had friends who said they didn't think they'd live past 35 for some obscure reason. I don't know why. Young people do that. But I also think this is an exceptionally hard time to be young. And I really feel for these kids. And I think anytime the problems have to be discussed. They have to be discussed, but they have to be discussed in a constructive way. I teach a course called Contemporary Moral Problems. It's like medical ethics, but it's a broader range of issues. And I try to hit the big ones, climate change and growing inequality and other things. And of course, every time you discuss it, you've got to discuss what can be done about it. Otherwise, all you're doing is just teaching them despair.
Yes, I agree with you. And it is a bit perplexing to me that there is so much despair these days. And on the one hand, I understand it because there have been economic hardships, there's a global pandemic, there are very real crises in the world. But on the other hand, the resources available to people in terms of access to knowledge and even material goods are unprecedented. So one has to balance these. But one aspect that I find a bit perplexing is I'm still one of the younger people in the transhumanist movement for whatever reason. And I'm 34 right now. And a lot of young people are technologically savvy. They know how to use computers, the internet, of course, mobile devices, various social media platforms that even I don't have familiarity with. And yet sometimes it's difficult for their circles and my circles to intersect, even though I believe someone like me definitely has the ability to interact with people across age groups and have these kinds of conversations. Do you see some sort of cultural discontinuity even between, say, the late millennials, such as myself, and the generations that have come after? And I ask because as a professor, you've seen these generations in your courses.
I think what I have noticed is they don't seem to read books much anymore. They read online. But reading, a segment of text online, even a long segment, it's a different experience from reading a book. And so I think to reach them, you've got to reach them in the places where they read and with the kinds of materials that they read. Other than that, I don't know that reaching them is really very different than reaching any other group. I think you just have to keep talking about it. You have to keep bringing it up. They're looking to us for leadership. They come to college, they sign up for a course called Contemporary Moral Problems. It's up to us to tell them what the problems are. And one of the reasons I wrote my book is I felt it was time for a book about this. There was only one other book on this topic, and it took a very different approach than what I was interested in doing. So fine, I'll put myself out there. I'm digressing a little bit here, but in that conversation I mentioned that I had with Aubrey, we're not like friends. I only had the one conversation with him, but I asked him, I said, if you really want to help life extension happen, what's the best thing to do for someone like me? And he said, the best thing you can do is just talk about it and keep on talking about it and get people used to thinking about it. So it becomes more familiar to them. And I think he's right. I think in the universities, if we talk to our students about it, that helps. I think events like this online will reach some people of every age. News interviews help. I think we'll just have to keep talking about it.
Yes, absolutely. And Ben has a follow-up.
Sorry, what's that other book? I have a guess, but please go ahead.
It's by Christine Overall, and I'm coming from memory here. I've got it actually in the index to this thing here. Hang on a second here. Let me find it for you. It is, Christine Overall, Overall, and it's called Aging, Death, and Human Longevity. Aging, Death, and Human Longevity, a Philosophical Inquiry. It came out in 2003. Yeah, I spent a couple of hours talking with one time. Very nice lady. And I think on balance, she's in favor of it too, I believe. But she comes at it with somewhat different issues. She's more interested, for example, in ageism and things like that than the approach I take in my book. I think, I wonder if my screen is frozen. Gennadi's image is not moving for some reason.
Yeah, I think Gennadi might have frozen up or dropped off. Okay. So in the meantime, let me ask a question. For example, suppose you have authoritative governments like China, and they say, hey, we've had lots of problems with overpopulation. We're not going to sign up for life extension. And along that, we have an ideology, we don't believe with it. And we are not going to, help other countries achieve it. They're a major supplier of a lot of pharmaceuticals. Well, what do you think? Is this sort of opposition from countries, either because they have some ideology or religious beliefs? Let's say, for example, Iran. They say, "Oh, it's an affront to God. We're going to oppose it, and we're going to do everything possible to, make sure it doesn't happen for you too."
Well, I would be very, very disturbed to see a government doing that. I can imagine it happening, certainly. I think opposition is more likely to come through things like not funding access for people. not paying for life extension for those who can't afford it, or not funding the research. I think opposition to life extension right now is happening primarily through insufficient funding, if the current funding is insufficient. I don't know if it is or not at the moment. But I think regimes still have to worry about popular will. No matter how dictatorial and authoritarian and undemocratic and vicious a regime is, it needs a certain level of popular support, or other actors, some colonel is going to stage a military coup, or something's going to happen. And so if they wander too far from what people want, they're going to lose the ability to stay in power. And I think that even in China, even with their restrictions on the internet, if life extension is possible in India, or America, or Japan, someplace else, the Chinese people are going to find out. And if lots of people here want it, lots of people in China will want it. And I think the government would just have to give in to the pressure. That's my best prediction anyway.
China's been pretty good at, controlling the amount of population they have too. How they do it is, up for debate on whether that's ethical or not, but they have been addressing the overpopulation issue already.
Yeah, they have. They got a lot of criticism for it, but I'm not sure their approach.
Well, they have addressed it to the extent that they have a real concern about a declining population forthcoming, because their reproductive rate is far below 2 children per woman, as it would be with the one-child policy, however imperfectly enforced. But I do think China is a case of this kind of preemptive application of population controls without seeing what would happen. And China did this in the 1970s, essentially when living conditions were miserable because of the legacy of Maoism, and probably the authorities who implemented the one-child policy could not see the prospects for the kind of economic development that occurred since that time, where China is actually one of the more prosperous countries, at least relatively speaking. So again, it does seem that, at least at this point, population controls are premature, and there are both a variety of forces to reduce population growth through people's voluntary choices, as well as to improve access to resources and habitable land, and loosen other constraints that people face. Now, it's interesting too, because Luis Arroyo has a comment that I think is germane about our prior discussion with regard to how to reach out to young people. And he recommends removing paywalls from books by making books free PDFs. This is a key way to reach young people in his view, because most of them do not have money to be throwing at books, especially because textbooks in college and high school are quite expensive. On the other hand, there's a lot of great literature out there that is in the public domain that can be found for free online. The problem, I think, is primarily with textbooks and research articles, which are sometimes behind paywalls that require $30 per paper. So what do you think about that? Do you think making access to cutting edge knowledge free of charge to young people would motivate them to become more engaged, and furthermore, to see more promise in the future?
Well, it wouldn't hurt. I mean, I'm all for lowering the cost of books for students. I very rarely use formal textbooks anymore because the prices are sky high. We've got students on my campus with food insecurity. We've got students who don't know where they're sleeping next week, whose cars don't run. I can't make them pay $70 for a little paperback or something like some publishers are charging. So I'm all for that, just on grounds of equity, and access to higher education. As far as the connection with life extension and reaching young people on that, it doesn't hurt. Although I don't think very many of them are going to be looking at scientific papers. They're much more likely to look at things like, the Transvision website, which I know has a number of articles on life extension. They're just going to Google the phrase life extension to see what's out there. And there's a lot of material, but yeah, on grounds of equity, I'm certainly in favor of making these things more available. A lot of these articles I'd like to get, and I can't spend $30, $40 for an article I haven't even looked at yet. It might not be worth reading.
Yes, and Alexandria Black remarks that we could just legalize Sci-Hub, which is a website that essentially bypasses a lot of the paywalls for the academic articles. And I myself am sympathetic to Sci-Hub. I'm not within academia, but my understanding is that money, it doesn't go to the authors of the papers. It goes to the journals.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be journals were hard copy things you got in the mail, and there was some expense to putting one out. But if I write a paper, I can format it on PDF to look like a journal article, and I can post it myself, and it costs nothing. So there's no reason for these journal companies to be charging vast amounts of money. I think eventually we're going to move away from some of this.
Yes, I certainly hope so. Now, one of our viewers' great points suggests, as a way of reaching young people, 2 to 5 minute videos and animations. And I agree, those could be powerful, especially as introductions to a particular topic. Now, do you think that they're useful beyond the introductory stage? And I understand as a gateway, they could be great. But what about motivating deeper thinking? So it's not just part of the entertainment routine that people will watch some fascinating videos and then they'll move on to the next topic. But what about them staying around and getting engaged to a greater level of depth?
Well, it's just an offhand thought. I can't say I've thought about this before, but I would think making available somewhat longer pieces and somewhat longer videos so they can sort of move up the ladder to other things. Not to plug my book here, but one reason I wrote it was I wanted to have a complete discussion of the arguments, which then could be whittled down and boiled down into simpler, shorter arguments that can be presented to the general public. To do this, you first have to work out the big version, and then you can mine that text for other arguments. So I think a latter approach where they go to longer videos and longer text, and ultimately to books written for the general public, not necessarily philosophy books like mine, would be the way to go. Working it into college courses would be a great way to go. I mean, one of my hopes with my book was that some of the chapters might be used in medical ethics and contemporary moral problems courses. And I know of at least one university where it has been. So just having material out there that can be assigned to students that's accessible would help also.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And Alexandria suggests that playlists could keep the course moving forward. Okay. So organizing a lot of the content that already exists online by subject matter might help. And of course, recordings like this one hopefully will help. And we have our Virtual Enlightenment Salon playlist on my YouTube channel where they can all be accessed. But in the future, we hope to create more coursework in effect on transhumanism and life extension as a subtopic of transhumanism, where we will have informational videos ranging from shorter ones to longer conversations like this one, and hopefully build up people's understanding and engagement. So this is, I think, quite a promising approach. Now, do you think it may be possible to turn this generation of young people into voracious readers? I remember an economics professor of mine in college suggested to all of his students, well, the time to read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations is now, not when you've graduated and you have other commitments, other time pressures. And I took him up on that offer. And actually, during my winter break, my second year of college, I read The Wealth of Nations from cover to cover. I don't know how many of his other students took him up on that offer, but I recognize now, after graduating college, one thinks life will get easier because one doesn't have homework and one is working to earn money, and one thinks one will have all this free time, but other commitments very quickly fill up that time. And I wish I had the time now to read something like The Wealth of Nations again. But how does one perhaps convey to young people that the time to engage in this detailed exploration of ideas is now? And if they do it now, then perhaps some of that skill set and the residual habits will stay with them for life. But it becomes more difficult to do it even as one becomes more established in life.
Oh yeah, it does, definitely. Yeah. I try to address that in my classes. You know, I teach in what's called one of the liberal arts. Well, students have no idea what that phrase refers to. Maybe they think it means we're all liberals or something. So I try to spend some time talking about why we study philosophy, what benefits you get, what liberal arts are, and why this is one of them. It has to do with liberating, by the way, and empowering. I try to talk about why they're in college. You know, the default assumption is they're in college to get a job and make money. And I have a deep and healthy respect for that. I'm all for that. I try to do a lot of career planning with my students. But I say to a lot of them, look, you should use this time to go watch a movie that you would never watch otherwise. Go see a ballet, march in a political demonstration, sit up all night talking about ideas with fellow students. You're not going to have this chance again. But I don't know how much one-on-one sermonizing really accomplishes with this. I think it's very hard to turn people into voracious readers. Voracious readers are a rare breed. And I think almost everybody who gets a degree in philosophy or something similar stops reading for the most part once they graduate for all kinds of reasons, good and bad. I don't know how to fix that. But you know, but back to life extension for a second. I think one thing that needs to happen, and I'm guessing you guys are probably doing this already, is to find a way to boil an argument down to a one-liner somebody can easily remember and use. So if somebody says it's not natural, they need a one-point response they can give. If somebody says the Malthusian objection is insurmountable, they need maybe 1 or 2 points to respond to that. And I think if you give them the equipment to hold their own in an argument, that goes a long ways.
Yes, indeed. And along these lines, I have been advocating for the creation of easily digestible, but also intellectually rigorous transhumanist content. And I don't like the standard uses of memes online, the images with the mock ironic content and the white blocky text. I think they're a bit lowbrow, but you can create imagery that is concise and messaging that is concise and can be posted in this image format without running afoul of some of those problems of meme culture. And the question is, will that spread, and will that spread to the people who need to see it? But yes, it's a great suggestion. Now, Luis Arroyo also says transhumanist reading groups would be interesting. So if a group of people gathers to commit to read a particular book and then discuss the ideas therein, as long as they can all find the time to commit to that in advance and they carry through with it, I agree, a lot of great insights can arise from that. Have you ever seen students do that spontaneously, just form their own reading group because they were interested?
I've never seen it. You know, I went to a liberal arts college that was as likely to produce that kind of behavior as any institution might, because it drew that kind of student. It didn't happen even there. You know, I don't know what to do about students not reading. Honestly, it frustrates the hell out of me. I wish I had a better answer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. I wish we all had a better answer. Now, Alexandria asks, how might we develop platforms for swarm learning? It's not as structured as a school. And she gives the analogy that courses can be more like libraries. Collaborative learning is already happening more spontaneously on Facebook and elsewhere. So as an example, sometimes I will post a question to my Facebook feed for any of my Facebook friends who have ideas to answer that. And sometimes the questions are very particular. I remember one situation where one of the hinges on my kitchen cabinets snapped. And the problem with this was a 30-year-old cabinet door where the hinge part was made in West Germany by a company that no longer exists. So everything online was more recent than that one particular hinge. And I even needed to identify the proper component to get for that. And my friends were able to help me narrow down the possibilities enough that I was actually able to get the exact replacement component. So do you see a potential for something like that to happen online? Maybe not a traditional reading group, but if someone has an interest and someone has a need, they could spontaneously assemble what Alexandria calls a swarm to solve this kind of issue.
Well, definitely. My fear is they might swarm into the discussion without swarming out to get some material first. But it's a start. Yeah, I would think anytime you've got, I'm not sure what the technical term for it is, but posts and responses on a web page, you've got a version of that. And if everyone's collaboratively working on a problem, you're going to get a lot of material being brought in. I'm imagining, for example, a life extension website with a page devoted to Malthusian concerns, let's say, just to pick that one. And somebody might post by saying, how do you respond, to such and such an objection? And people might then bring in links to other responses online. I think that kind of thing works very well.
Yes, indeed. Now, another thought that I've had on this issue of how does one get across to people, and furthermore, how does one find common ground, is with regard to argument mapping. So often I find that discussions, especially among laypersons, they remain in kind of nebulous territory because somebody has an objection to an idea such as life extension, but the objection is very broadly articulated. And it's not that there is no agreement or common ground on the premises at all. It's that the reservations are actually very specific, but the person expressing those reservations doesn't get to that level of specificity. So they might, for instance, invoke the overpopulation argument, but why do they think there's a risk of overpopulation? And it could be something very particular, like they believe there's water scarcity, for instance, and that issue will never be overcome. And if one focuses more on just the generic responses to that, one might never get to the actual source of that person's reservation. So do you think a more widespread practice of, say, mapping out the argument and the key positions that each party has expressed and where they agree, where they disagree, and honing in on the disagreements would help? Or do you think there's a kind of block, a mental block for many people to even get to the point where they agree to sit down and engage in that kind of exercise?
There may be a mental block like that, but I think I believe this quite deeply, quite strongly. And in some ways, awareness of this goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, who wrote about this in the context of philosophy. The way to persuade somebody is to start by acknowledging what is true about what they're saying. You first have to come across the street over to their side and say, you're right. Overpopulation is a potential problem. You're right. If people live longer, it could be a larger population. I see why you're concerned. That's a legitimate concern. I hear you. I too am worried about this. And then you can talk about your own views. You can say, now, speaking just for myself, the reason that I became convinced that we should proceed with life extension is X, Y, Z. Whether it's technological solutions or some other solution. So you put the counter argument in terms of what persuaded you rather than why it should persuade them. So you're talking about your own views without attacking theirs and acknowledging theirs constantly. That's the only way. Nobody ever persuades anybody by giving them reasons why they should change their mind. People just freeze up and they will not budge. And I think you have to argue dialectically. The word comes from the word for dialogue, obviously. You have to go over to their side, figure out what is it about what they want or what they're doing that makes sense from their point of view, and acknowledge that so they trust you. That's why I felt it was so important to talk about the Malthusian problem the way I did. I felt that people who have this concern, it's a very widespread concern, and they need to feel like they can trust us. And to do that, we have to acknowledge what is legitimate about their worry, namely that when a world is overpopulated, that is a problem, unless some solution is found, whether it's technology or something else. So I think you have to start, even if you don't agree with what they're saying, by acknowledging why it makes sense to them. And when you present counter arguments, you have to talk about why it made sense to you, because they're not going to attack you as easily as they'll attack some argument. That's how I think we should do it.
Yes, indeed. And Alexandria refers to a practice called steel manning, which is the opposite of straw manning, which is presenting the strongest possible version of the other side's argument and then seeing how one can address that.
I tell my students that all the time in philosophy courses. Always pick your opponent's strongest objection, their strongest argument. Give them the best hearing you can. If you can defeat that, then you've actually gotten somewhere. If you give a weaker argument, you haven't established anything.
Yes, and I think this speaks to a major issue that we have in our culture today, which stems from the political hyperpolarization, where everything has been drawn into this dichotomy between left and right, and it creates the exact opposite tendencies from what makes a good, persuasive dialogue, because people become so entrenched in every position they hold, and then every lifestyle choice, even any brand of product that one identifies with, becomes a kind of tribal signal, whether one is on the blue team or the red team. So how do we overcome that, the kind of impatience and tolerance that has been engendered by this polarization?
Well, I think you have to start by showing respect. Rarely is anybody completely, totally wrong about everything. There's usually something there that is some version of a legitimate concern under certain conditions. You got to start with that. I think you also have to pick whatever overlap or agreement there is. For example, wouldn't it be nice if we could find cures for aging-related diseases? Well, of course, nobody wants to die from cancer, so we can focus on that. So I think if you want to fight siloization, it helps if you leave your silo, and go see somebody else's silo and talk to them for a while. You've got to start by listening. You can't start by talking to them. You've got to let them talk to you. So I suppose that's one reason I suggested that if you want to present a counter argument, present it in terms of why you found it persuasive. You say, what finally changed my mind was when somebody said this to me. And then it's not an attack against them. You're not attacking their identity. You're removing it from a question of their identity and just talking about your identity. And I think it's less of an attack and less likely to force them into a defensive posture.
Yes, indeed. Now, Alexandria has an interesting question, and that is with regard to essentially how can we get people to incrementally become more receptive to life extension? So the people who are skeptics, how can we get them to become a little less? It's not really likely that in a given conversation, one is going to reverse a person's view held through a lifetime of experience. Mm-hmm. So how do we get them perhaps to move a little bit over time, especially if there are opportunities for repeated interaction, so that they'll become at least a little more receptive and then perhaps even more receptive?
Well, I think the scientists that are working on life extension are already doing a version of that, because what they tend to do in their public statements is talk about, finding cures for aging-related diseases. What do you do about diabetes? What do you do about your heart health? How do you keep your immune system strong? And I think the incremental steps towards life extension are going to be cures for all the maladies we really don't want to have right now, so that extended life becomes a byproduct of ending these various things that shorten our life. And so I think the incremental steps would have to be the way the scientists who do, geroscience approach this. They don't talk about life extension very often. They mostly talk about curing diabetes, or preventing cancer or something like that. I think that's a good way to do it.
Yes, and it's true that very few people would oppose cures for cancer or diabetes, especially given how much interest and activism has been dedicated to that. So Celeste Castaldo writes, we need to encourage the positive feedback for the billionaires who are investing in life extension research companies, et cetera. And this has been brought up in the conversation around perhaps why aren't more billionaires interested in this? And some people have pointed out that there is a potential for kind of negative publicity, or perhaps these billionaires, they're beholden to many more interests than we might think. For instance, if they're CEOs of publicly traded companies, then every move that they make is scrutinized by analysts and investors. And if somebody doesn't like something, their stock price will plummet and then they will get blamed for it. So these people tend to be a lot more cautious than one would think a person with their degree of money and ostensible power would be. But it's because they're not entirely free agents. They're beholden to a lot of these outside pressures. So perhaps interestingly enough, part of the solution could be to empower these individuals to think of themselves more as free agents, that if they are billionaires, they want to solve a problem, they should have the wherewithal to do that. But how can perhaps we, the public, encourage them to be more forthright in their support of life extension, especially if they have leanings in that direction?
Well, I think the thing I'm stumbling over is I don't know how to get them to listen to me at all. I'm not sure that I could tell them anything that they would listen to, because they've got other conversations going on. I think journalism's handling it for us. I think the press gives attention to everything Elon Musk says, everything Jeff Bezos says, and some of the other well-known figures. I think that's the positive feedback right there. The mere fact that attention is being given is probably all we really can do. I'm not sure. The only other thing I could think of would be ready to deal with the objection that if the billionaires are doing this, they're the only ones who will get it. So maybe if I were to give somebody like Bezos, or I forget their names, the founders of Google, some advice, it would be, explain that you don't want to keep this just for yourself. You want everyone to have it. Say so. Tell us that. We need to hear this. This is not going to be something you're going to monopolize for your own group, or make so expensive nobody can have it. They need to tell people what the ultimate goal is. If the ultimate goal is for everyone to get it at an affordable price, they need to say that. It would be awfully helpful if they would actually take that step, because I think right now, when you hear Jeff Bezos talking about living a lot longer, you think, well, yeah, sure, Jeff Bezos is taking care of Jeff Bezos. What about me? Jeff Bezos could answer that by telling us what he's going to do for the rest of us.
Yes, indeed. And
good advice. Good advice.
Yes, I concur with it as well. And also, I would like to thank Alan Crowley for his super chat. We appreciate his generous contribution, and for attending and viewing the virtual Enlightenment Salons as always. Now, Luis Arroyo points out that telling people won't be enough. He thinks capitalists always speak but rarely deliver. And I know he's coming at this from more of a socialist perspective. I'm more inclined to think that wealthy people can be benevolent, particularly if they've earned their wealth. And we see a lot of self-made billionaires these days, the ones who are self-made, like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, to some extent, Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates. They do tend to engage in more philanthropy, and they tend to do it through more efficacious means. So perhaps more of the old money will fund opera houses and libraries, which is worthwhile to do as well. But they're less interested in pushing outward the possibilities of technological progress. And I think the people who made their money directly by serving consumers, they're more likely to try to democratize the consumer benefits as well. But there is a public relations issue there. And I think it is worthwhile to consider how can that public relations problem be overcome, especially because sometimes the media loves sensationalism. So one of the strategies of media sensationalism is, even if there's something obviously good and beneficial to large numbers of people, some reporter is going to try to do an expose on it because that expose can make that person famous. So I suppose an interesting area to ask your questions on would be, how can media sensationalism more generally either be countered in our culture or harnessed in a way that's beneficial to progress?
Well, I think one thing that would help is if the media knew how to find people to present the other point of view. When they like to have two heads talking, typically, they like a horse race or an argument. And so if somebody has made a sensationalist story about Jeff Bezos and how selfish he is and how dangerous he is and so on, the media needs to be able to find somebody they can put up on screen to say, well, maybe this is actually a good thing, and here's why. So I don't know exactly how that's handled, and I don't know who provides lists of such people to the media, but if your party, for example, were to have a kind of index of people who can be called upon on this topic, that topic, that topic, You could always go to NBC, or whoever it is and say, look, you ran a story on this, but if you consider talking to these guys over here, I think that might help. The media has an innate desire to bring in another half of the conversation. They're always better with a conversation than with a monologue. And so if they've done something sensationalistic, then they've got a new thing to report, which is the fact that somebody disagrees with them, keeps the story going.
Yes, it is indeed worthwhile to consider it from this perspective, because the media are not necessarily our enemies. They just have a certain dynamic by which they operate. They have certain incentives. And if we can find a way to leverage those incentives for a good purpose, then we should do that. Now, there has been some controversy in transhumanist circles about this. Do you think any publicity is good publicity, or do you think there are limits on what kind of publicity would be desirable? And I have my own views on this, but I'd be curious about yours.
For life extension, I think there's some limits. Well, no, let me take that back for just a second. I want to put the point in another way. I think any publicity is good publicity, but I'm not sure any comment somebody might make publicly about life extension is going to be helpful. So if it's simply a matter of getting attention for this, it's hard for me to see a problem with it unless they're doing things like reporting failed experiments or nut cases who wear aluminum hats at home and have bizarre ideas about life extension. Okay, I'm going to change my answer one more time. I'm not sure any publicity is good publicity. As I think this thing through out loud, I think if you put people up who have silly ideas about life extension, and they're obviously silly, that's going to make the whole field look silly. There was a guy who specialized in emergency medicine who wrote a book on life extension back in the 90s, and it just wasn't very well thought out. He wanted to do the whole thing in terms of telomeres, which is a legitimate and serious approach. But he was jumping the gun and publicizing it before the science was really ready. So I think you have to be careful about reporting that sort of thing. You have to be careful about reporting people who want to do the whole thing through vitamins,
Yes, and I definitely agree that not all publicity is good publicity. Sometimes I find the problem stems in particular from people who become spokespersons, not because of the merit of their ideas, but because of charisma or the desire to bring about shock value. And if they engage in those kinds of tactics, then that could be to the detriment of the image of the movement. On the other hand, if they present themselves as respectable, as sophisticated, as respectful toward others, then most of what they do publicly can be good publicity. So,
yeah, I think it's very important to emphasize. I do this every time I talk about life extension, especially to an audience that isn't already familiar like you guys are. I put it, it's mainstream geroscientists at major accredited universities with big reputations and big grants from the NIH who say, we're going to get this. Okay, I got to stress the mainstream part of that. You've got to make it look legitimate, not like science fiction. And again, to make the point one more time, you've got to respect people's concerns. You've got to be able to express those concerns in ways that they recognize they've been heard, and then be prepared to respond to them. So I think anybody who's got a hardline, one-sided view of this may be doing more damage than good.
Yes, and Alexandria points out that what works in rock and roll culture doesn't work in science. And indeed, science is about following a rigorous systematic method and testing hypotheses and being quite honest about what works and what doesn't work and what needs to be refined. And in that situation, I think science differs from a lot of cultural expectations in that failure is acceptable, at least in theory, it's acceptable, because if you pursue something rigorously and methodically, your initial hypotheses might not turn out to be valid, but at least you advance the field by means of that discovery. And I just wish people respected that approach a bit more and respected people who thoroughly and objectively study the evidence and change their minds if they need to.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of that right now with COVID science and vaccine science. The scientists seem to contradict themselves over time because they're learning as they go. They're being honest about this.
Yes, and Jason Mallory points out in our chat, science is truth, clickbait is not. And I just hope we can find a way to enable the approach of science to be more appealing to more people than clickbait. So,
the beauty of life extension is that the background science is absolutely fascinating. You know, it's the theories of aging and the evolution of aging are just incredibly interesting.
absolutely. And they are of vital importance, literally, to all of us. If scientists succeed here, then the greatest problem, the greatest predicament of our species and for ourselves as individuals will be overcome. And certainly, I hope this is worthwhile to inspire people, motivate them to action. What do you think of repetition as at least one of the arsenal of techniques that we have, in the sense that there have been studies that show that perhaps people who are exposed to an idea once might not remember it or find it as compelling as people who have encountered it multiple times from multiple sources, and then they start giving it more credence and serious consideration?
I hate to say it, but I think it's highly effective. I don't like doing it. I mean, if you pursue an academic career, one of the best things you can do to promote yourself in your work is to say it over and over and over and over and over in as many different places and publications as you can. I hate doing that. You know, when I've written something, I want to move on to the next thing. Not once again explain what I already did in some publication isn't necessary because I got it right the first time. But that's what you have to do. And I've been advised by that, you know, advised to do that by department chairs and such. Yeah, and I think repetition is extremely important. If nothing else, if somebody hears something often enough, they'll stop and think about it eventually instead of just letting it slip past them.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what will help most of us be able to focus on a variety of ideas and topics of interest is if more of us are in the field, especially with regard to communication about life extension, because for any given person who encounters these ideas, they will probably be more persuasive if different people articulate them, perhaps with some different nuances to speak to the concerns or areas of interest of different people. So all of you watching this, Aubrey de Grey is right. One of the most effective things you can do is just talk about these ideas and bring your own perspective to them, your own strongest arguments if you support life extension, your own style of communication, again, as long as it's not focused on shock value or the detriment of others. Perhaps you can sway some people that I or the other panelists in this discussion might not. Yes, indeed. So now I think we've come to the point in our virtual Enlightenment Salon where we will go to each of the panelists for their final question or comment. And then, as is our practice, we will let our guest have the last word. So let us start with Art Ramon Garcia.
Yeah, in science fiction, like in movies like Underworld, we have these vampires and they take breaks from living. They go into a suspended animation and it could be like 100 years and they come out of it. So that would be one way to counter the argument that you'd get bored. Well, if you are bored, just take a break and throw yourself in suspended animation for 10 years, 100 years or whatever, and come out and see what it's going to be like. So.
Interesting.
Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yes, indeed. And to bring some of our audience comments in on this question of boredom, there were some great responses from Brian Brain, who says, only boring people get bored. Mike Lazine, who says, people who say mortality or extended life is boring have no imagination as to what they can get done. And I think Art Ramon offered a creative possibility there. Daniel Twett writes, there are so many books about life extension, you could hardly read them all in an average lifespan. And I think that's a great point. There is so much in any given field of endeavor that I don't see how someone who immerses him or herself into that field could ever feel bored. And I haven't felt bored ever since I was 10 years old. And of course, as a kid, sometimes it's difficult to find constructive outlets for one's time. But when one learns how to do that, I just don't see boredom as an option. I see the opposite problem, too much to do, not enough time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the boredom issue is overplayed, really. I think that we don't know what it's going to be like to have lived for 200 years, and it's somewhat speculative to suggest we're going to be bored. But I think that it's highly unlikely the boredom will be a problem that we can't overcome one way or another. I speculate in my book, by the way, about the possibility of a boredom pill. You know, why not a pharmaceutical that keeps your interest engaged?
Yes, indeed. If there is a biochemical component to that, then certainly in the future, some sort of pharmaceutical or similar intervention could affect that. Now let's go to Ben Ballweg.
So John, I did ask you some email questions in the prior week. I wondered if I could get any last thoughts you didn't get to today about them. One was about how current structures inhibit life extension research.
Yeah.
And other was about like the hesitation with people now being more that they are just skeptical of the science rather than that they are worried about if it did come, how would we handle it? So any last thoughts you had about those you didn't get to today?
Well, I think obstacles to research have to do partly with this notion that you shouldn't fund research that isn't about, you know, that aging isn't a disease. Okay. I think there's no good moral reason not to fight aging, even if it isn't a disease. It makes no moral difference to me. I think it happens to be a disease. But one of the big obstacles is the FDA is locked into this idea, or at least has limited its approval to things that are about diseases and not aging. So that's an obstacle. Another obstacle that's not institutional is to identify effective biomarkers. We need to know how fast people are aging. We need to know it with some accuracy. And so there's research going on with biomarkers that will help quite a lot. As far as people who dismiss the idea, I think when people dismiss it, they dismiss it in one of two ways. They either dismiss the possibility that it can happen. They think life extension is a bunch of bunk and it'll never happen. Or they dismiss it by saying you'd never want it anyway, and typically both. I ran into a version of this recently with a paper I was working on with my demography colleague, Shaheen Davidpour, and it was about the Malthusian stuff and the projections and so on. And we had a lot of trouble with journals, especially demography journals. And when he talked to his colleagues in demography, he kept running into the same kind of objection over and over and over again. They'd say, well, that'll never happen. That's impossible. And then if pressed, they say, well, who'd want it anyway? You would never want that. And I run into this a lot. It's really nice to talk to people like you guys because you get it. But outside of this kind of a setting, it's really hard to get people to take it seriously. And I don't know what to do about it, except what we've already talked about doing, you know, cite the mainstream science, bring in the NIH. It's hard not to take life extension seriously if Google's putting a couple of $1 billion into it. Just point that out. But there's a level of resistance, and I have to believe it's connected. I think those who resist extended life itself, perhaps because of an adaptive preference or envy or something like that, might do a preliminary version of that adaptive preference by simply refusing to take the concept seriously as a scientific possibility. That may be one of the ways in which they deny this. And so I think it's not so much about whether they think the science is plausible, it's whether they want it to be plausible. That's a tough one.
Yes, indeed. And we have observed in the past that the feasibility and desirability reservations that many people express are linked. And sometimes if you push them on one aspect, they tend to default to the other one. And there does need to be a way to break that feedback loop. I think most likely the solution is to just chip away at both the feasibility and the desirability reservations, and to do it frequently, as we have been doing over the past 2 decades. And I think it has worked to a certain extent. When I speak with lay people about the possibility of radical life extension, most of the time, I don't encounter complete skepticism. I would say 50% of the people I encounter are mildly receptive, and the other 50% will raise the kinds of typical counter arguments, the overpopulation argument, the boredom argument, the dictators will live forever argument, but at least they're engaged.
Yeah.
And when they're engaged, it's possible to have a conversation and perhaps sway them gradually, or at least have them acknowledge that this is a possibility. If they're concerned about it, it's something real and feasible to be concerned about.
Yeah, I've noticed the same percentages. When I talk to, whether it's groups of students or lay people generally, there's a roughly 50-50 split, maybe 60-40 one way or the other sometimes.
Yes, indeed. And it'll be interesting to see how this evolves this decade. This has already been a decade of immensely rapid changes and turbulence. And I do wonder how people's attitudes will follow suit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now let us go to Celeste Castaldo.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the great interview and discussion, and thank you, everyone. So I want to encourage you, in case you have not yet, Professor, to take a look at our membership page, and please encourage all your students to watch the video. I'm going to try and sign up all the California University students to the U.S. Transhumanist Party. I think a lot of the younger people have just started paying more attention to the media and may have missed the great media attention we did get when Zoltan Istvan was running for president, and we actually got really positive media from all sides of the major news, which is impressive. That's very rare. And so anyway, I think that a lot of the younger people aren't as aware of a lot of the Transhumanist Party, the U.S. Transhumanist Party to begin with, and I'd like them to become aware of it. And I'm very appreciative of what you're doing in academia and bringing this life extension really to the forefront in the academia, especially here in the California system. That is excellent. And that's all I wanted to say was thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. And thank you very much, Celeste, as always, for your efforts in promoting awareness of transhumanism and the U.S. Transhumanist Party. I have posted the link to the membership application page in our YouTube chat. It takes less than a minute to apply. Membership is free. We have the option for people anywhere in the world to become allied members of our organization and participate in our internal deliberations. So please join us if you haven't already. This offer will be good indefinitely. So even if you're coming to this recording many months after the event, still go to transhumanist-party.org/membership and join. Now let us go to Jason Geringer.
I'd just like to say to everybody, if you want to keep the conversation going, I'll probably be going to Discord after this. So in case you want to chat. And John, I'd love it if you could put a big old plug for your book again.
Okay.
That way you don't feel bad about it. It's me asking. So
should I do it now?
Yes,
Yeah,
please
sure.
do.
Okay. So it's called New Methuselahs, MIT Press. Got this really pretty picture. That's actually the Methuselah tree. It's a bristlecone pine up in California, thought to be the oldest, it's now second oldest tree in the world. That's why there's a tree on this thing. Beautiful thing about this book is MIT only wants $40 for a copy. So it's hardback, but it's at a really good price. And if you're interested in life extension, this has references to a lot of material. So hope you like my book, New Methuselahs. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And interestingly enough, I have a lot of imagery of the Methuselah tree that I own myself, including this picture from Death is Wrong, which is the illustrated children's book on indefinite life extension that I authored. And I also have several paintings at my home of bristlecone pine trees because of their exceptional longevity and resilience. And I hope that one day the human species will be able to reach those kinds of venerable ages. And yes, everyone, please look into New Methuselahs, get the book, consider the arguments therein. This session was a preview of those arguments, but there's a lot more detail in the book for you to explore. Now, let us go to Alexandria Black for her final remarks.
Where was I starting? Getting back to the dialectical issues, maybe we should incorporate more game B thinking, because these are actually the epistemological ninjas of this space that are trying to work out philosophically what the next world could become. I mean, they're not saying they have all the answers yet, but they're well along the way. I mean, maybe you've heard of Daniel Schmachtenberger's The War on Sense-Making series. I think this group just had a gig this weekend. Yeah, it was like in the morning, Saturday, well into day. We'll have to check that out. But and we also have, well, Schmachtenberger and Jamie Wheel came out of the Lonja City self-experiment group and came up with some pretty good stacks, which you can find at Neurohacker Collective. I'm not just trying to plug that, but I'm trying to show that there's relevance, some overlap between our communities. Are you familiar with this philosophical camp? And we've got Jim Rutt, who used to head the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity Studies. And I just think that we have a lot, they've already done a lot of the legwork that we might be able to take on and not have to reinvent the wheel and work out a lot of these dialectical issues.
I'm not familiar with that, but it sounds very interesting. I'll have to have a look at that.
How do I find, well, in the after chat, tell me how to find you later, and maybe we can swap some links.
You bet. Let's do that.
Yes, indeed. And in the YouTube chat and our internal chat, I posted a link to our virtual Enlightenment Salon with Jim Rutt of Game B and Santa Fe Institute fame, which we held on March 15th, 2021. That was a great philosophical conversation as well, where we explored some of the philosophical similarities and the differences between Game B and transhumanism. And I think what was great about that conversation was precisely that we were able to hone in on areas of difference and discuss them in a very nuanced way. So I would highly recommend that discussion for anyone watching this. Now let us go to Jose Cordero for his final comments.
Thank you once again, John. It has been really fantastic to listen to you, and I am looking forward to read your book from the MIT Press. But some comments. My friend Ray Kurzweil, who is also from MIT, he studied at MIT, and he's actually part of the board of directors of MIT currently. He's 8 years older than you. And he says that he is expecting to reach longevity escape velocity by 2029, 2030. That will basically let him live long enough to live forever. Still aging, because longevity escape velocity will not make you younger yet until we reach 2045. Those are the dates that Ray and I myself use continuously. So because he's 80 years older than you and he plans to make it, you should also plan to make it.
I will.
Number one. So the other thing, because you were involved in translation long ago, you should come to the new one, because this is going to be the largest, biggest, and best translation conference ever in history. Of course, it has to be improved in the future, but I'll tell you why. We are working on a declaration to say that aging is a disease, but a curable disease. In fact, because of that, I am organizing the conference at the College of Medicine of Madrid that has 40,000 members, and where the two medical doctors who became Spanish Nobel laureates in medicine, Ramon y Cajal, for example, used to teach. We will be in that auditorium where Ramon and Cajal discovered neurons and synapses. Wow. And yeah, it's really fantastic. Actually, the mayor of Madrid is going to open the conference as well. So this is big, big, big. With a declaration, with the mayor of Madrid, with 40,000 medical doctors in the college. They will not be in the event. Mm-hmm. And some of you have already registered, like Ben. Ben, thank you so much for registering for the online streaming. But you are welcome to come, John, in person, or you can join the streaming and watch it on time, real, live, or you can watch it later at your own pace. So welcome to Madrid. Let's declare aging a disease and cure it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you to Jose. And Ben Ballweg has a request for you to share the name of the demographer that you were working with again.
I'll put it in chat right here. He's at Northwestern right now. I think that's the correct spelling. I don't recall which department he's in, but I can email me. I can get you more information. Pass his email on to you. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And let us see. I don't see it in the chat yet, but I will share it if and when it appears.
Maybe I said it to Jose. Sorry, I said it to everyone here. My mistake. Let me do that again. Yeah, he was just hired at Northwestern University. I don't recall which department it is, but that's where he is. Very smart guy.
This is Shaheen Dawoodpour of Northwestern University. So thank you very much. And I would encourage people to research his work. It sounds quite fascinating with regard to performing these hypothetical studies of how demographics would be affected by various changes to human longevity. And now we have come to the point in our virtual Enlightenment Salon where we would ask you, Professor Davis, to provide your final comments. What would you say that perhaps hasn't been said yet, or how would you characterize the conversation as a whole? And what insights would you have for our viewers moving forward?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that the very first thing I ever wrote about life extension was presented in, I believe, 2003 at a Transvision conference that was at Yale that year. Nick Bostrom was organizing it. And so my association with transhumanism goes back a long ways. And you guys have been a safe harbor for me for a long time in working on this topic. And I very much appreciate that. Kudos to you for the great work that you're doing. And it's a nice symmetry that I've come back to Transvision again after all this time. I'll just make one comment. This has been a true salon. It really is a salon. I mean, you called it that in your email. Well, okay, that's a nice name for it. It actually is a salon. There's a vibrant intellectual community, a discussion going on outside the universities, and this country desperately needs that. Our conversations should not all be in the academy. And I think sometimes we've overly academicized some disciplines, philosophy included. So I'm really so glad to see that there's such a lot of thinking going on and so many different possibilities. And so much of this is out of the box. People wouldn't consider things that wouldn't be considered in a more conventional setting. It's incredibly valuable, and I'm very glad to have been a part of it. And I thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great honor to hear those good words from you. This is exactly what we seek to accomplish with the virtual Enlightenment Salons. And I'm immensely pleased that we were able to do that today. Alexandria in our chat says that salons are a form of the swarm learning that she was describing. So that is also a great way to characterize it. And we hope to bring this kind of environment and these kinds of conversations to our audiences going forward. So please tune in every Sunday, most of the time at 1 p.m. US Pacific time, though on October 3rd, it will be a bit different to be announced because RADFest is happening on October 3rd. RADFest is the premier conference on longevity. It's going to be held virtually this year from the 2nd to the 3rd, and RAD stands for Revolution Against Aging and Death. So please check that out. I will be there at RADFest on an activism panel with regard to longevity moderated by Joe Bardeen. So this panel, I think, will discuss some of the same crucial questions that we addressed today with regard to what works, what doesn't work, how can we become more effective advocates for life extension. So I hope to see you next week, both at RADFest and at our future stream. And until then, live long and prosper.
Thanks, everybody. Great meeting you all.
Live long and